Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rental ad had been too good to be true, and I should have known better. Furnished room, rural setting, $400 month, immediate occupancy. In a market where studio apartments cost 3 times that, I'd driven the 2 hours to Millbrook Farm without a second thought. The caretaker, a weathered man named Dutch who spoke in clipped sentences, had shown me to the converted quarters behind the main farmhouse. The room was sparse but clean, with a kitchenette and a bathroom that smelled faintly of copper pipes and old water. What Dutch hadn't mentioned during the tour was the basement. I discovered it 3 days into my stay, when I was searching for the circuit breaker after the power flickered during a thunderstorm. The wooden door was tucked beneath the narrow staircase, nearly invisible in the shadows. The brass handle turned easily in my palm, as if it had been recently oiled. The stairs descended into darkness that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight. The basement stretched further than the footprint of the house above, disappearing into corners my light couldn't reach. The air was thick and still, carrying the scent of aged wood and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. Dust motes danced in my flashlight beam like microscopic snow, and my footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted by the space itself. That's when I saw it. Against the far wall stood what had once been a crib, but enlarged and modified for an adult. The wooden frame had been expanded, the sides raised to nearly 4 feet high, with vertical slats that cast prison bar shadows in my flashlight's glow. But instead of a mattress, the interior had been fitted with closet rods and shelves. Clothes hung from the rails. Men's clothing, old-fashioned and musty, swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. I approached the bizarre piece of furniture with the careful steps of someone walking across ice. The wood was dark with age, polished smooth by countless hands. Brass hinges gleamed despite the dust that coated everything else. A latch mechanism had been installed on the outside, the kind you might find on a garden gate, designed to keep something in rather than out. The clothes continued their subtle dance as I examined them. Wool trousers, cotton shirts, a few jackets with wide lapels that spoke of decades past. They moved with an almost hypnotic rhythm, swaying inward toward the center of the converted crib as if embracing an invisible occupant. I reached for the latch to examine it more closely, and that's when I felt them. Hands, heavy and warm, settling on my shoulders with the weight of familiarity. They guided me forward with gentle but insistent pressure, encouraging me toward the opening of the modified crib. The touch wasn't threatening. It felt almost paternal, the way a parent might guide a tired child toward bed. I jerked away, stumbling backward into the darkness. My flashlight beam swept wildly across the ceiling, revealing water stains that looked like reaching fingers and exposed beams that groaned with the weight of the house above. When I steadied the light on the crib again, the clothes had stilled, hanging motionless as if they'd never moved at all. But I could still feel the phantom impression of those hands on my shoulders. I climbed the stairs quickly, trying to convince myself that the incident had been a product of poor lighting and an overactive imagination. Old houses made strange sounds, created odd air currents. The clothes had been disturbed by my presence, nothing more. The sensation of hands had been my mind's attempt to process the unfamiliar environment. Yet as I closed the basement door behind me, I could have sworn I heard a soft sigh echo up from the darkness below. That night I called Dutch to ask about the basement. His voice carried a weight I hadn't noticed during our initial meeting. Previous owner was eccentric, he said after a long pause. Name was Cornelius Hathorne. Lived alone for 40 years after his wife passed. Had some unusual ideas about rest and solitude. When I pressed for details, Dutch's responses became increasingly cryptic. Hathorne had been obsessed with what he called the cultivation of silence, the pursuit of a sleep so deep and peaceful that it transcended ordinary rest. The man had believed that most people never truly slept, that their minds remained too active, too connected to the waking world to achieve genuine peace. Said the secret was returning to the beginning, Dutch explained, his voice growing distant. Going back to the first sleep, the kind we had before we learned to fear the dark. I asked about the modified crib, though I didn't mention that I'd found it. Cornelius believed that adult furniture was designed to maintain connection to consciousness, Dutch said. Beds that let you roll around, change positions, stay partially alert. He thought that by sleeping in a more confined space, in the fetal position he'd been born to, he could achieve something deeper, a silence that went all the way down to the soul. The line crackled with static before Dutch continued. Spent his last 5 years sleeping down there every night. Claimed it was the most peaceful rest he'd ever known. When we found him, he was smiling. I wanted to ask how Hathorn had died, but something in Dutch's tone suggested the conversation was over. He hung up without saying goodbye. Over the following days, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the basement door. I told myself I was simply curious about the house's history, but each time I descended those creaking stairs, the pull grew stronger. The clothes in the modified crib continued their gentle swaying, creating patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Sometimes I caught myself staring at them for minutes at a time, mesmerized by their rhythmic motion. The hands returned regularly now. They would settle on my shoulders whenever I stood near the crib, guiding me with increasing insistence toward the opening. The touch was warm and comforting, like being welcomed home after a long journey. I began to understand why Hathorn had found peace in this place. There was something profoundly restful about the basement's embrace, a quality of silence that went beyond mere absence of sound. It was a silence that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against my skin like warm water. When I stood in the basement, the constant chatter of my conscious mind began to quiet. The endless stream of thoughts that normally kept me awake at night, worries about work, relationships, the future, faded to a whisper. I started spending longer periods in the basement, sitting on an old wooden crate and letting the silence wash over me. The clothes would continue their eternal dance, and I would watch them until my eyes grew heavy. Sometimes I would find myself nodding off, my chin dropping toward my chest as the deep quiet pulled me toward something that felt more profound than ordinary sleep. It was during one of these sessions that I first climbed into the crib. I don't remember making the conscious decision. One moment I was sitting on the crate, watching the clothes sway in their hypnotic pattern, and the next I was lying curled on my side within the wooden confines, my knees drawn up to my chest. The clothes hung above me like a canopy, brushing against my hair and shoulders with touches soft as whispered lullabies. The position should have been uncomfortable. I'm a tall man, and the space required me to curl tightly to fit. But as I lay there, something extraordinary happened. The tension I'd been carrying in my muscles for years began to dissolve. My breathing slowed and deepened until it matched the rhythm of the swaying clothes. The silence grew thick around me, muffling not just sound but thought itself. For the first time since childhood, I experienced what I can only call perfect rest. Not sleep exactly, but something deeper. A state where consciousness didn't disappear so much as expand, becoming one with the darkness and quiet of the basement. I floated in that space between waking and dreaming, cradled by the wooden walls and the whispered movement of fabric above me. When I finally climbed out, hours had passed without my awareness. My body felt refreshed in a way that no ordinary sleep had ever achieved, but my mind was unsettled. The experience had been too intense, too complete. It felt like I'd touched something that human consciousness wasn't meant to encounter while still tethered to the waking world. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the crib nightly. Each session brought deeper rest, more profound silence. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would lie in the modified crib and feel my sense of individual self dissolving, merging with something larger and more peaceful than anything I'd ever known. But there were side effects. During the day, ordinary sounds seemed harsh and jarring. Conversations felt like intrusions, their meaning increasingly difficult to process. I began to crave the basement's silence with an intensity that scared me. Sleep in my regular bed became impossible. I would lie awake for hours, my body aching for the wooden embrace of the crib. I called in sick to work more frequently, spending entire days in the basement. The clothes seemed to welcome me, their swaying becoming more animated when I appeared. Sometimes I thought I could see shapes among them, the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a torso, as if they were dancing around an invisible partner. The hands on my shoulders grew bolder, more insistent. They would guide me not just toward the crib, but into specific positions within it. They seemed to know exactly how I should curl my body for maximum comfort, how to position my arms and legs for the deepest rest. Under their guidance, I began to achieve states of consciousness that felt more like hibernation than sleep. During one particularly deep session, I experienced something that shattered my remaining skepticism about the basement's nature. As I lay curled in the crib, the silence around me began to take on a voice, not heard but felt, speaking directly to the part of my mind that processes dreams and fears. The voice told me about Cornelius Hathorne's final years, how he had gradually learned to shed the burden of waking consciousness. It described the peace he had found in returning to that primal position of rest, the way the silence had welcomed him deeper and deeper until he had achieved something beyond ordinary death or sleep. The voice whispered of others who had found their way to this place, drawn by the same need for perfect rest that now consumed me. It promised that I could join them in that eternal silence, that all I needed to do was surrender completely to the basement's embrace. The modified crib would become my cocoon, the hanging clothes my guardians. I would cultivate silence until silence cultivated me in return, drawing me into a rest so deep that the distinction between sleeping and waking would become meaningless. When I emerged from the crib that time, dawn was breaking outside. I had been in the basement for over 12 hours, yet I felt as if I'd only just closed my eyes. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man I barely recognized, pale, with dark circles under my eyes despite my profound rest, and the expression of distant satisfaction that reminded me of the descriptions of Hathorne's final smile. That's when I knew I had to seal the basement. The realization came not as a moment of clarity, but as a desperate instinct for survival. Some part of my mind, the part that still remembered what it meant to be fully awake, recognized that I was being consumed by something beyond my understanding. The basement's silence wasn't just offering rest, it was offering oblivion, a release from the burden of consciousness that came at the cost of consciousness itself. I spent the day researching contractors, looking for someone who could seal the basement permanently. But even as I made the calls, I could feel the pull of the space below, the promise of that perfect silence waiting just beyond my reach. My hands shook as I dialed numbers, and my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. That evening, as I sat in my regular bed trying to sleep, I could hear the clothes rustling in the basement below. They were moving more actively than ever, swaying and dancing as if celebrating an approaching reunion. The silence seemed to seep up through the floorboards, pressing against me with increasing insistence. The hands returned, heavier now, more urgent in their guidance. They settled on my shoulders with the weight of inevitability, encouraging me toward the basement door. As I resisted, they grew more insistent, the pressure increasing until I felt like I was being physically pulled from my bed. I found myself standing at the top of the basement stairs without remembering how I'd gotten there. The darkness below pulsed with invitation, and I could see the faint outline of the modified crib waiting in the depths. The clothes were moving in complex patterns now, weaving shapes in the air that spoke of welcome and homecoming. This is where my memory becomes unreliable. I remember descending the stairs, but each step seemed to take an eternity. The basement stretched before me like a vast cathedral of silence, and the crib glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with any earthly source. The clothes reached for me as I approached, no longer just swaying but actively beckoning, their fabric fingers extended in greeting. I remember lying down in the crib one final time, feeling the wooden walls close around me like protective arms. The silence became a living thing, flowing into my mouth and nose and ears until it filled every space within me. The boundary between my body and the basement dissolved, and I felt myself becoming part of something larger and more peaceful than individual existence could ever offer. But I also remember climbing back out, though I can't say when or how. I remember running up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind me, then dragging my dresser against it to keep it closed. I remember calling the contractor at 3 in the morning, begging him to come immediately, offering double his usual rate to seal the basement that same day. The work was completed within hours. The contractor asked no questions as he bricked up the basement entrance, though I caught him glancing nervously at the wooden door as he worked. When he finished, the basement was entombed behind a wall of concrete and steel, accessible to no one. That was 3 weeks ago. The rental house sits silent now, the basement sealed beneath layers of stone and metal. I moved out the day after the work was completed, forfeiting my deposit and leaving no forwarding address. I'm writing this from a motel room 2 states away, where the beds are uncomfortable and sleep comes in brief, unsatisfying fragments. But here's what troubles me most. I can still feel the silence calling. Even hundreds of miles away, even through concrete and steel, I can sense that perfect rest, waiting in the darkness. Sometimes late at night I feel those familiar hands settling on my shoulders, guiding me toward a peace I can never quite reach. And every night, as I lie in these strange beds fighting for ordinary sleep, I find myself wondering if I ever really climbed out of that crib at all. Perhaps I'm still lying there in the basement, curled in the fetal position that Cornelius Hathorne found so peaceful, cultivating a silence that has finally, completely, cultivated me. The clothes would be swaying above me now, weaving their eternal dance around my resting form. The hands would have guided me into perfect position, and the silence would have claimed me as its newest gardener. In that deep quiet below the earth, I would finally have found the rest that consciousness had always denied me. But if that's true, then who is writing these words? Who is remembering the taste of the basement's air, the weight of those guiding hands, the promise of peace that waits in the darkness? Who is fighting every night against the urge to return to that sealed tomb, to tear through concrete and steel to reclaim the silence that was cultivated for me? I tell myself these are the thoughts of a man who escaped, who recognized the danger and sealed it away before it could claim him. But in the deepest part of the night, when sleep finally comes in its brief and unsatisfying forms, I dream of hanging clothes and wooden walls, and a silence so profound it makes the beating of my heart sound like thunder. And in those dreams, I am always, always going home. Story 2. The fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed like an angry wasp trapped in amber. 3:17 a.m., according to my phone's cracked screen, its blue glow cutting through the darkness of my cramped bunk. The hostel's heating system had given up sometime around midnight, leaving the building wrapped in a chill that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. My bladder's insistence finally overcame my reluctance to venture into the communal spaces at this ungodly hour. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my roommates, a backpacker from Germany who spoke in his sleep, and a construction worker who'd been staying here for 3 months because it was cheaper than rent. The floorboards groaned under my bare feet despite my efforts at stealth. This place had character, the receptionist had assured me when I checked in 2 days ago. What she'd failed to mention was that most of that character manifested as suspicious stains, persistent odors, and the kind of settling sounds that made you wonder if the building was slowly collapsing, or just very, very tired. The hallway stretched before me like the throat of some enormous beast. Emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow pools separated by expanding darkness. 23 rooms on this floor, most occupied by transients like myself. People caught between destinations, between decisions, between versions of themselves. The carpet beneath my feet felt damp despite the absence of any visible moisture, as if the building itself was perspiring. That's when the first door slammed. Room 237, about halfway down the corridor. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot, sharp and final. I froze, listening for footsteps or voices, some indication of human agency behind the noise. Nothing. just the fluorescent light's incessant buzzing and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Probably the wind, I told myself, though I couldn't recall any windows being open in the hallway. Old buildings had their quirks: settling foundations, warped frames, doors that didn't quite fit their jambs anymore. Perfectly reasonable explanations existed for everything if you looked hard enough. I continued toward the bathroom, my bare feet making soft slapping sounds against the damp carpet. The chemical tang of industrial disinfectant grew stronger with each step, mixed with something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Another door slammed. Room 241, this time closer to my destination. The sound reverberated through my chest, and I felt my heartbeat quicken in response. 2 doors in as many minutes seemed excessive even for a building with structural issues. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to complete my business and return to the relative safety of my shared room. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, pale light seeping through the gap. I pushed it open and stepped inside, grateful for the harsh brightness that banished the hallway's oppressive shadows. The space was larger than I'd expected, but somehow felt cramped, as if the walls were pressing inward. 3 stalls, 2 urinals, and a long mirror above a row of sinks. Everything was clean in the aggressive way that suggested frequent and thorough chemical attention. As I approached the nearest urinal, a whisper drifted from somewhere behind me. "Sorry." The word was barely audible, more breath than voice. I turned around, expecting to find another late-night wanderer, but the bathroom was empty. The stalls stood open, revealing their vacant interiors. No one lurked behind the door or crouched beside the sinks. Just me and the humming fluorescent tubes overhead. Acoustics, I reasoned. Sound carried strangely in buildings like this, traveling through walls and pipes in unexpected ways. Someone in an adjacent room had probably spoken, and the words had found their way to me through some architectural quirk. I completed my business quickly, eager to return to bed. As I moved to the sinks to wash my hands, I noticed the mirror was fogged despite the bathroom's dry air. Condensation clung to the glass in irregular patches, creating a distorted reflection that made my face appear fragmented and strange. The water from the tap ran lukewarm, and I scrubbed my hands with the institutional soap that smelled like nothing and everything at once. That's when I saw them, the droplets. Instead of following gravity's pull downward, several beads of condensation were moving upward across the mirror's surface. Slow, deliberate migration against every natural law I understood. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception, but the phenomenon continued. Water climbing glass like tiny transparent insects ascending a vertical surface. My reflection stared back at me through the patches of clarity, and I noticed my eyes looked different somehow, wider, more alert, as if my mirrored self was more awake than the original standing before the sink. "Sorry," came the whisper again, clearer this time. The sound seemed to emerge from the mirror itself, or perhaps from the plumbing behind the wall. I leaned closer to the glass, studying my fractured reflection, when my mouth opened and spoke words I hadn't intended to say. "It's okay." The voice was mine, but I hadn't made the decision to speak. The words had simply emerged, as involuntary as breathing. My reflection continued staring at me, but now its expression carried something I hadn't seen before. Relief. Profound, desperate relief, as if a terrible burden had been lifted. But my reflection's response came a beat too late, creating a disturbing disconnect between cause and effect. I watched myself mouth the words a second time, an echo of something I'd already said, and the delay sent ice crawling up my spine. I backed away from the mirror, my hands trembling. The upward-moving droplets had multiplied, creating strange patterns across the glass surface. They formed shapes that almost resembled letters, symbols that hovered at the edge of recognition before dissolving back into random moisture. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer despite their continued buzzing, and shadows gathered in corners that should have been fully illuminated. I needed to leave, to return to my room and convince myself that exhaustion had manufactured the entire experience. But as I turned toward the door, the whisper came again, louder now, more distinct. Sorry, sorry, sorry. Multiple voices speaking in unison, layered like a chorus of regret. The sound emanated from the pipes in the walls, from the drains beneath my feet, from the mirror behind me. I spun around and saw my reflection multiplied across the fogged surface. Dozens of versions of myself staring back with varying expressions of confusion, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like hunger. I stumbled toward the door, my legs unsteady. The hallway beyond looked different now, longer and narrower than before. The fluorescent light continued its manic buzzing, but the sound had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost like Morse code. The emergency lighting cast sharper shadows, creating geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Back in my room, I climbed into bed and pulled the thin blanket over my head. My roommate slept on, undisturbed by whatever had transpired in the bathroom. The German backpacker mumbled something in his sleep. Numbers, I thought, or maybe names. The construction worker's breathing created a steady rhythm that should have been comforting, but instead sounded like machinery grinding to a halt. Sleep eluded me for the remaining hours until dawn. Every small sound, the building settling, pipes clanging, distant footsteps, sent my nervous system into overdrive. I found myself straining to hear that whispered apology, dreading and anticipating its return in equal measure. When morning finally arrived, I ventured back to the bathroom with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Daylight streaming through a small window had transformed the space completely. The mirror showed only normal condensation patterns, water droplets following predictable gravitational paths. My reflection behaved exactly as reflection should, mimicking my movements without delay or independent expression. I splashed cold water on my face and examined myself in the glass. Dark circles under my eyes, stubble that made me look older than my 32 years, and a pallor that suggested too many nights in places like this. Nothing supernatural about any of it, just a man who'd been traveling too long, staying in too many temporary accommodations, accumulating too much stress and too little sleep. Yet as I dried my face with a rough towel, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Writing on the mirror, or at least the suggestion of writing. Letters formed by moisture that hadn't quite evaporated, spelling out words I couldn't quite read before they faded completely. Over the following days, I developed a routine around the bathroom encounters. I would wake at various hours, sometimes by choice, sometimes dragged from sleep by that insistent whisper, and make my way down the hallway. The doors continued their unpredictable slamming, always different rooms, always when I was alone. The mirrors consistently fogged in impossible ways, and my reflection continued its delayed responses. But I began to understand the pattern. The whispered apologies weren't random. They were requests. Pleas from something trapped within the building's infrastructure, seeking acknowledgement and forgiveness for some unnamed transgression. Each time I responded with acceptance. It's okay. I forgive you. No problem. The present seemed to gain strength, clarity, coherence. My reflection grew more independent with each encounter. Sometimes it would smile when I frowned, or turn its head when mine remained still. The delay between my actions and its responses lengthened, creating an increasingly disturbing disconnect. I began to suspect that whatever was trapped in the plumbing was learning to inhabit the mirror space, using my image as a template for manifestation. The other residents noticed my deteriorating condition. The German backpacker asked if I was feeling well, pointing out that I'd grown pale and distracted. The construction worker mentioned that I'd been talking in my sleep, though he couldn't make out the words. The receptionist suggested I might be happier in different accommodations, perhaps somewhere with better soundproofing and more reliable heating. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something fundamental was happening here. Something that challenged everything I thought I understood about reality. Either I was experiencing a genuine supernatural phenomenon, or my mind was constructing an elaborate delusion. Both possibilities terrified me in different ways. The breakthrough came on my 7th night, when I woke to find the bathroom mirror completely covered in condensation, except for a single clear patch in the center. Through this window, my reflection stared back with an expression of desperate urgency. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear through the glass barrier. I leaned closer, trying to read its lips, when understanding struck me like a physical blow. The presence wasn't just seeking forgiveness, it was seeking escape. The mirrors, the plumbing, the entire infrastructure of the building had become a prison, and my acknowledgement of its apologies was somehow providing the energy it needed to break free. But escape to where? Into the mirror space? Into the hallway? Into me? My reflection pointed urgently toward something outside my field of vision. I stepped back and saw it. A roll of duct tape sitting on the edge of the sink, definitely not there when I'd entered. The sight of it triggered a memory, or perhaps an instinct, about containment and sealing, about preventing things from escaping their designated spaces. I understood what needed to be done, though not why I understood it. Working quickly, I tore strips of tape and began covering the mirror's surface, starting from the edges and working inward. My reflection watched with growing alarm, its movements becoming more frantic as the tape closed off more of its space. It pressed its hands against the glass from the inside, mouth opening in what might have been a scream or another apology. The whispers from the walls grew louder, more agitated. "Sorry, sorry, sorry," echoing from every pipe and drain, a chorus of regret that filled the bathroom with sound. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strobing shadows that made everything seem to pulse with unnatural life. As I applied the final strip of tape, covering the last clear section of mirror, my reflection pressed its face against the glass one final time. Its expression had changed completely. No longer relief or urgency, but profound sadness mixed with what might have been gratitude. Then the tape sealed it away completely, and the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No humming lights, no creaking pipes, no settling sounds from the building's structure. Just perfect, crystalline quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I backed away from the covered mirror, my hands shaking. The bathroom felt normal again, just a utilitarian space with harsh lighting and institutional fixtures. No supernatural presence, no impossible physics, no rebellious reflections. Whatever had been trapped here was either contained or banished, sealed away behind strips of duct tape like some makeshift exorcism. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of myself in the small shaving mirror mounted beside the larger one. My reflection looked back with tired eyes and a haunted expression that seemed entirely appropriate given the circumstances. Except this reflection raised its hand in a small wave goodbye. I fled the bathroom and didn't return for the remainder of my stay. The next morning, I checked out early, claiming a family emergency that required my immediate departure. The receptionist seemed relieved rather than surprised, as if she'd been expecting my hasty exit. As I wheeled my suitcase past the bathroom one final time, I noticed that someone had removed the tape from the mirror. Fresh strips hung from the sink's edge, curled and useless. The glass surface was clear and clean, showing only empty space where reflections should have been. I've stayed in dozens of accommodations since then: hotels, hostels, bed and breakfasts, friends' couches. None have had unusual mirror behavior or mysterious whispers. My reflections behave exactly as they should, mimicking my movements with perfect synchronization. Everything is normal, rational, explicable. But sometimes, in the moment between sleep and waking, I hear a faint whisper drifting from bathroom pipes, or see condensation patterns that seem almost like writing. And occasionally, when I'm not paying close attention, I catch my reflection doing things I don't remember doing. Small gestures, subtle expressions, movements that lag just a beat behind my own. I tell myself it's residual anxiety from that week in the hostel, psychological after effects of stress and sleep deprivation. The mind is remarkably capable of creating experiences that feel supernatural when they're actually products of brain chemistry and circumstance. Every anomaly has a rational explanation if you're willing to look for it. But I've stopped looking too closely at mirrors in dimly lit bathrooms, especially in older buildings with complex plumbing systems. Some investigations are better left unfinished, some questions better left unanswered. And sometimes, when I'm alone in those transitional spaces between destinations, I find myself wondering, What happens to the apologies that no one accepts? Where do they go when there's no one left to forgive them? The answer, I suspect, is that they wait. Patient and persistent, gathering strength in the spaces between spaces, until someone comes along who's willing to listen. Someone who might respond, "It's okay." Someone who might not realize, until it's too late, that acceptance can be a form of invitation. Story 3. The first time I saw my reflection wearing funeral attire, I convinced myself it was a trick of the desert light filtering through the warehouse's grimy windows. After 30 years restoring artifacts from the Old West, I'd seen enough strange things to know that shadows could play elaborate games with a man's perception. But the cold breath that escaped when I touched the coffin's glass lid, that defied every rational explanation I could muster. The piece had arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a trucking company that specialized in historical acquisitions. The shipping manifest listed it simply as display coffin, circa 1880, tombstone territory. What struck me immediately wasn't its age or provenance, but the craftsmanship. Someone had commissioned this burial vessel with an extraordinary attention to detail that bordered on obsession. The wood was mahogany, deep and lustrous despite more than a century of existence, carved with intricate scrollwork that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. But it was the glass panel that dominated the upper half, a single, flawless sheet of what appeared to be hand-blown crystal, so clear it seemed almost liquid. I'd been hired by the Deadwood Tourism Bureau to prepare the coffin for their new Mysteries of the Frontier exhibit. The pay was generous enough to overlook the peculiar circumstances surrounding its acquisition. According to the paperwork, it had been discovered in the basement of a demolished funeral home in Tombstone, Arizona, sealed behind a false wall that workers had broken through during renovation. No records existed of its original occupant or the funeral director who had commissioned it. The previous owner, an estate liquidator named Cornelius Blackwood, had insisted on including a handwritten note with the delivery. "Do not open after sundown. Return immediately if reflections appear incorrect." I'd laughed at the melodramatic warning initially, filing it away with similar nonsense I'd encountered over the years. Collectors of Old West memorabilia seemed drawn to fabricated mysteries and manufactured curses. But now, standing in my workshop with the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete floor, Blackwood's words echoed with an uncomfortable resonance. The temperature around the coffin remained consistently 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the warehouse, despite the New Mexico heat that typically turned the building into a furnace by midday. When I ran my hand along the glass surface, condensation would appear instantly, as though my warm palm had touched something frozen. More disturbing still were the moments when I glimpsed movement within the crystal depths, not reflections of the warehouse interior, but images that seemed to originate from within the glass itself. The first clear manifestation occurred on my third day working with the piece. I was cataloging its dimensions and documenting the carving patterns when I noticed my reflection had changed. Instead of my usual work clothes, faded jeans and a cotton shirt, the figure in the glass wore a black suit of unmistakably Victorian cut, complete with a high collar and silk tie. A white lily was pinned to the lapel, and my hands were folded in the traditional pose of the deceased. Most unsettling of all, my reflected eyes were closed, though I stood before the mirror fully alert and watching. I stepped back from the coffin, blinking hard and rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, my reflection had returned to normal, showing only a middle-aged man in work clothes with premature gray streaking his brown hair. But the memory of that other image lingered, accompanied by a sensation I couldn't quite identify, as though I'd been observed by someone standing directly behind me, their presence so close I could feel the disturbance in the air. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the week progressed. Even in my apartment 15 miles from the warehouse, I found myself jolting awake in the pre-dawn hours with the absolute certainty that something was wrong. The feeling would persist until I drove to the workshop, key in hand, heart hammering against my ribs as I approached the building. Each morning, I discovered the same thing. The coffin had moved. Never dramatically. That would have been too obvious, too easily dismissed as the work of an intruder or my own faulty memory. Instead, the displacement was subtle but unmistakable. On Thursday, it had rotated perhaps 3 degrees clockwise from its position the previous evening. Friday morning, I found it 2 feet closer to the eastern wall. By the following Monday, the coffin had traveled nearly halfway across the warehouse floor, always facing a different direction, always covered with a thin layer of dust that seemed far too uniform and recent to be natural. The most disturbing discovery came when I began examining the floor around the coffin's various positions. In the concrete dust that accumulated daily despite my regular cleaning, I found footprints. Not the heavy, practical boot prints I might expect from an intruder, but the narrow, formal outline of dress shoes, the kind worn with funeral attire. The prints always began at the coffin's location and traced a careful path across the warehouse, terminating exactly where I customarily stood when entering the building each morning. I started arriving at different times, using different entrances, even parking in various locations around the warehouse. It made no difference. The footprints invariably ended at my position, as though whoever or whatever left them possessed an uncanny knowledge of my habits and movements. Worse still, the impressions in the dust appeared fresh each morning, suggesting they were created during the night hours when the building stood empty and locked. By the second week, my hands had developed a persistent tremor that made precision work nearly impossible. Coffee tasted like ash, and food had lost all appeal. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty warehouse, partially to break the oppressive silence, but also to reassure myself that my voice still functioned normally. The sound echoed strangely off the walls, returning to me with subtle distortions that made my words seem foreign and unfamiliar. The rational part of my mind searched desperately for logical explanations. Perhaps the building's foundation was shifting, causing the coffin to slide gradually across the slightly uneven floor. The dust patterns could be explained by air currents from the ventilation system, and the footprint shapes might be nothing more than random impressions created by settling debris. Even my altered reflection could be attributed to stress-induced hallucinations, or optical illusions created by the glass's unusual thickness and clarity. But rationality became increasingly difficult to maintain when the whispers began. They started as barely perceptible sounds that could easily be dismissed as wind through gaps in the warehouse walls or the settling groans of aging metal and wood. However, as my time with the coffin lengthened, the whispers grew more distinct, forming what sounded almost like words in a language I couldn't identify but somehow understood. The voice seemed to emanate not from any particular direction, but from within the glass itself, as though someone trapped inside was attempting to communicate through the crystal barrier. The content of these whispered communications filled me with a dread that transcended mere fear. They spoke of patience and waiting, of a long journey nearing its conclusion. They described the comfort of eternal rest and the peace that came with surrendering to inevitable fate. Most unsettling of all, they addressed me by name, not my professional title or the surname printed on my business cards, but the childhood nickname my grandmother had used, which I'd never shared with anyone in my adult life. Sleep deprivation and stress began affecting my judgment in increasingly dangerous ways. I found myself standing before the coffin for hours without memory of how I'd arrived there, my hand pressed against the glass surface while that other reflection stared back with eyes that remained perpetually closed. During these episodes, the warehouse seemed to fade around me, replaced by what appeared to be the interior of a 19th century funeral parlor, complete with heavy drapes, flickering gas lamps, and the overwhelming scent of lilies and embalming fluid. The transition between these visions and reality became so seamless that I began questioning which state was genuine. Perhaps I was actually lying within the coffin, experiencing elaborate dreams of a life as a restorer in modern-day New Mexico. The theory gained terrifying credibility when I noticed that my reflection's funeral attire was becoming more detailed with each encounter. The black suit now showed subtle pinstripes, the lily on the lapel displayed individual petals, and a watch chain had appeared across the vest, connected to a timepiece whose hands remained frozen at midnight. Desperation finally drove me to contact Cornelius Blackwood, whose phone number I discovered buried in the shipping documentation. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been expecting my call for quite some time. "You've been looking in the glass," he said before I could explain my situation. His tone held no surprise, only a weary resignation that suggested he'd had this conversation before. I attempted to describe my experiences, but Blackwood interrupted with details so accurate they could only come from personal knowledge. He knew about the moving coffin, the dust patterns, the footprints, and most unnervingly, the changing reflection. When I mentioned the whispers, he fell silent for so long I wondered if the connection had been lost. "How long have you had it?" he finally asked. 2 weeks tomorrow." "Then you don't have much time left. The previous caretaker lasted 18 days before we found him." The word "found" sent ice through my veins. Found him how? Standing in his workshop at 3 in the morning, perfectly dressed in funeral attire that fit him exactly, though he'd never owned such clothes. His eyes were closed, and he was smiling, but he was breathing and responding to his name. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him physically, but he insisted he was dead and needed to return to his coffin. He's been in a psychiatric facility ever since, completely convinced that his life as a restorer was an elaborate hallucination he experienced while lying in state. Blackwood's explanation provided no comfort, particularly when he revealed that 5 previous caretakers had experienced similar progressions. Each had started with the moving coffin and altered reflections, progressed to whispers and time distortions, and ultimately reached a point where they could no longer distinguish between their actual lives and the funeral parlor visions. The psychiatric evaluations were consistent. Each man believed he was actually deceased and had dreamed his entire adult existence while awaiting burial. "What's in the coffin?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Nothing. That's the problem. It was made for someone who never occupied it, commissioned by a funeral director who disappeared the night before the burial was scheduled. The family found him 3 weeks later, wandering the desert in formal attire, claiming he was late for his own funeral. He died in an asylum, insisting until his final breath that he was still waiting to be properly buried." The line crackled with static, and Blackwood's voice became distant and hollow. "The coffin is looking for its occupant. It always has been. Each person who spends enough time with it becomes a candidate, and the glass shows them what they'll look like when they finally accept their role." That night, I didn't return to my apartment. Instead, I remained in the warehouse, determined to observe the coffin's nocturnal behavior directly. I positioned myself behind a stack of crates where I could watch the entire floor without being seen, armed with a thermos of coffee and a battery-powered lamp. The temperature dropped noticeably after sunset, and the whispers became more insistent, no longer content to remain barely audible. Around midnight, the coffin's lid opened with a soft pneumatic hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. A pale light emanated from within, casting shifting shadows across the warehouse walls that moved independently of any light source I could identify. The whispers intensified, becoming almost conversational in tone, though the words remained in that unknowable yet comprehensible language. What emerged from the coffin wasn't a figure in any traditional sense, but rather a distortion in the air itself, a human-shaped absence that moved with deliberate purpose across the warehouse floor. It left footprints in the dust despite having no visible substance, and when it reached the center of the room, it stopped and turned in my direction. Though I couldn't see eyes or facial features, I felt the weight of its attention with paralyzing intensity. The entity stood motionless for several minutes, and I had the distinct impression it was evaluating me, measuring my suitability for some purpose I didn't want to understand. Then it raised what might have been an arm and beckoned with a gesture that seemed both invitation and command. The rational voice in my mind screamed warnings about hallucinations and psychological breaks, but my body responded without conscious decision. I found myself walking toward the apparition, each step feeling predetermined and inevitable. The warehouse around me flickered between its familiar concrete and metal structure and the elaborate funeral parlor from my visions. Gas lamps materialized along the walls, casting warm yellow light that made the shadows dance more vibrantly. When I reached the coffin, the entity gestured toward the glass surface. My reflection stared back, now completely transformed. The funeral attire was perfect in every detail, from the silk-lined jacket to the polished shoes. My hands were folded peacefully across my chest, and my face wore an expression of serene contentment I'd never achieved in waking life. Most disturbing of all, my reflected eyes remained closed even as I stood looking into them. The whispers became clear-spoken words in my grandmother's voice. "It's time to rest, Thomas. You've been walking around far too long for someone who died in 1983. The memory hit me with devastating clarity. The car accident on the desert highway during my senior year of college, the long skid across the center line, the impact with the oncoming truck, the sensation of floating above my body while paramedics worked frantically to revive me. I'd always assumed they'd succeeded, that the bright light and tunnel everyone described had been nothing more than oxygen deprivation and wishful thinking. But what if I'd been wrong? What if the 30 years since the accident had been an elaborate dream experienced while waiting for proper burial? The theory explained so much. My social isolation, the way food had gradually lost its taste, the increasing difficulty sleeping, the sense that I was somehow disconnected from the world around me. The entity beside me nodded approvingly, as though it could read my thoughts. It gestured again toward the coffin, and I understood this wasn't a threat or coercion, but simply a correction of a long-standing error. I was being offered the chance to claim what had rightfully been mine for decades. I placed my hands on the glass lid, feeling that familiar cold breath escape as the seal loosened. The surface was smooth and welcoming, and my reflection smiled for the first time since I'd begun working with the piece. The funeral parlor was now completely solid around me, the warehouse having faded to an insubstantial memory. Organ music played softly from somewhere beyond my vision, and the scent of lilies filled the air with overwhelming sweetness. As I prepared to step into the coffin, a discordant sound shattered the peaceful atmosphere. My cell phone was ringing. The modern electronic tone cut through the 19th century ambiance like a knife, and the funeral parlor wavered like a mirage disturbed by sudden wind. The entity beside me recoiled, its form becoming even less substantial, and the whispers rose to an angry crescendo before fading entirely. The gas lamps flickered and died, leaving only the harsh fluorescent security lighting of the warehouse. I stood alone beside the coffin, my hands still pressed against the glass, my reflection now showing only a disheveled man in modern work clothes who looked as though he hadn't slept in weeks. The phone continued ringing, anchoring me to a reality I could no longer trust but couldn't completely abandon. I answered without checking the caller ID. Blackwood's voice emerged from the speaker, distant and concerned. "Thomas, I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you at the warehouse?" I looked around the empty building, noting the familiar concrete floors and metal walls, the stacks of wooden crates and restoration equipment. Everything appeared normal except for the coffin, which now seemed somehow diminished, less imposing than it had moments before. "I'm here," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Good. I've arranged for pickup tomorrow morning. A private collector in Montana has agreed to take it off your hands. You just need to stay away from it until then." The relief I should have felt was overshadowed by an unexpected sense of loss. Looking into the glass one final time, I saw only my own tired reflection, dressed in rumpled work clothes, eyes open and clearly alive. But something in that reflection seemed incomplete, as though it was missing some essential component that would make it whole. I agreed to Blackwood's arrangements and left the warehouse without looking back. By morning, the coffin was gone, loaded onto a truck bound for Montana, and a new caretaker who would presumably experience his own progression through moving furniture, altered reflections, and whispered invitations to eternal rest. But as I returned to my normal routine, eating meals that now tasted like ash, sleeping fitfully in a bed that felt more like a temporary resting place, conducting restoration work that seemed increasingly pointless, I couldn't shake the suspicion that I'd made a terrible mistake. The brief glimpse of peace I'd experienced while looking into the glass had been more genuine than anything I'd felt in years. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers calling my name. The Story 4. The first thing I noticed about the ground floor apartment wasn't the suspiciously low rent or the eager way the landlord avoided eye contact when I signed the lease. It was how the afternoon light died the moment it touched the windows, as if the glass itself had been stained with something that consumed illumination rather than filtered it. I moved in on a Tuesday, carrying my life in 3 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag that had seen better decades. The furnished apartment came with the basics: a couch that sagged like a broken spine, a bed that creaked with each breath of wind through the walls, and windows that faced a small courtyard where weeds grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intentional. The blackout curtains were my first purchase. I'd always been a light sleeper, and the streetlights outside cast shadows that moved in ways that made sleep impossible. When I hung them that first weekend, the apartment transformed into a cave. Perfect darkness, perfect silence, except for the tapping. It started the very first night after I installed the curtains, a gentle rhythmic percussion against the bathroom window, the one above the shower. Tap, 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 like fingers drumming against glass but wooden, hollow. I assumed it was a tree branch, though I couldn't recall seeing any trees close enough to the building when I'd walked the perimeter during my initial visit. I ignored it the first week. City living meant learning to filter out the urban symphony. Sirens, car alarms, the neighbor's television bleeding through paper-thin walls. But this sound was different. It had a persistence that suggested intention rather than randomness. It followed no pattern of wind or weather. On still nights when not even the leaves rustled, the tapping continued with metronomic precision. By the second week, I found myself lying awake, counting the intervals between taps. 7 seconds, always 7 seconds, never 6, never 8. The consistency was unsettling in a way that made my skin feel too tight, like a shirt that had shrunk in the wash. I investigated during daylight hours, opening the bathroom window and leaning out to examine the courtyard. The space was smaller than I'd remembered, surrounded by a chain-link fence that separated our building from the undeveloped lot behind it. Wild grass grew in thick patches, interspersed with saplings and the occasional pile of construction debris. And there, perhaps 10 feet from my window, stood a tree stump. Not a stump, exactly. More like a section of trunk, maybe 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, standing upright as if someone had planted it there intentionally. The bark was dark, almost black, with deep grooves that created patterns across its surface. From my angle, those patterns looked almost like faces, like eyes watching back at me. I photographed it with my phone, though I'm not sure why. Some instinct told me to document what I was seeing, as if my memory might prove unreliable later. When I reviewed the image, zooming in on the details, those groove patterns became even more pronounced. The wood grain formed concentric circles that from certain angles resembled iris patterns, and there were what looked like tears running down from those wooden eyes, dark stains that could have been sap, but seemed too fresh, too deliberate. That night, the tapping grew louder. I lay in bed, blackout curtains sealing me in complete darkness, listening to the percussion symphony from the bathroom. But now it wasn't just tapping. There were other sounds, a low creaking, like old floorboards settling, and beneath that, something that might have been whispering. The sounds were too muffled by the bathroom walls for me to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably human. Someone was speaking in rhythm with the tapping. I crept to the bathroom and pressed my ear against the window. The glass was cold, far colder than it should have been given the mild October weather. Through the blackout curtain I'd hung over this window too, I could see nothing, but I could hear everything. The whispering was clearer now, though still incomprehensible. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. The words had a guttural quality, punctuated by clicking sounds that seemed to come from the back of the throat. And underneath it all, that relentless wooden tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against bark. Against my better judgment, I pulled back the corner of the curtain and peered outside. The stump had moved. Where before it had stood 10 feet from the window, it now squatted perhaps 6 feet away. In the amber glow of the courtyard's single security light, I could see that those eye-like patterns in the bark were more pronounced, as if they had somehow deepened since I'd last looked, and they were wet. Dark fluid seeped from the grooves, creating trails down the trunk's surface that caught the light like tears. I blinked, certain I was seeing things wrong in the poor lighting. When I looked again, the stump appeared to be in its original position, but something about the shadows around it seemed wrong. as if they extended in directions that defied the single light source. Sleep became impossible after that. I found myself checking the bathroom window multiple times each night, documenting the stump's position with photos taken through the glass. But the images never showed what I thought I was seeing. In daylight, reviewing the pictures on my phone, everything looked normal, just a dead tree trunk in an overgrown courtyard, positioned exactly where a tree trunk would naturally be after removal. It was only at night, when the security light cast those amber shadows, that things seemed different. The stump appeared closer some nights, farther others. Once I could have sworn it had rotated, presenting a different face to my window. The eye patterns shifted too, sometimes appearing as two distinct faces, other times as a single larger visage that seemed to span the entire visible surface of the trunk. The whispering grew stronger. By the third week, I could hear it even with the window closed, even with the curtains drawn. The words remained foreign, but their intent became clear through repetition and tone. They were calling to me, inviting me outside. I started researching the building's history, spending my lunch breaks at the public library, digging through old city planning documents and construction permits. What I found made my hands shake as I turned the yellowed pages. The land had been purchased from the city 15 years ago, but before that, it had been designated as a cultural preservation site. The original survey noted the presence of what archaeologists had identified as a ceremonial grove, a cluster of trees that appeared to have been deliberately cultivated and maintained by indigenous peoples for possibly centuries before European settlement. The grove had been cleared for development despite protests from local tribal representatives. According to a newspaper clipping I found buried in the municipal archives, tribal elder Margaret Windwalker had warned that disturbing the grove would break the bark trade and leave spirits without their vessels. The phrase meant nothing to me then, but I copied it into my notebook alongside the other strange details I'd uncovered. The trees had been massive, some over 300 years old, and when they were cut down, the lumber company had reported unusual difficulty with the job. Chainsaws had malfunctioned repeatedly. Workers had complained of feeling watched while they worked. Several had quit mid-job, claiming they could hear voices coming from inside the trees as they cut. Most of the lumber had been sold, but according to the cleanup reports, several stumps and trunk sections had been left behind due to what the foreman described as equipment problems. The city had eventually given up trying to remove them and simply built around what remained. That night, armed with this new knowledge, I approached the bathroom window with different intentions. Instead of simply observing, I wanted to understand. I opened the window despite the October chill and leaned out into the courtyard air. The whispering stopped immediately. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, unnaturally loud in the still air. The security light flickered once, twice, then stabilized, casting that familiar amber glow across the overgrown space. The stump stood in its usual position, but now I could see details that had been invisible from inside. Carved markings along its base, symbols that looked both ancient and fresh, as if they had been recently renewed. And movement, subtle but unmistakable. The bark was shifting, expanding and contracting like breathing, like a slow wooden heartbeat. I pulled back inside and closed the window, but the image was burned into my vision. In the darkness of my apartment, I could still see that breathing bark, those carved symbols, the way the amber light had seemed to pulse in rhythm with the trunk's movement. The next morning, I woke to find dark stains on my pillow. At first I thought it was blood from a nosebleed, but when I touched the marks, they were sticky and sweet-smelling. Sap, tree sap on my pillowcase, though I had been nowhere near any trees. I showered immediately, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw. But as I dried off, I noticed dark spots on my shoulders in the bathroom mirror, small at first, no larger than freckles, but clearly visible against my pale skin. They looked like drops of sap that had somehow soaked through to stain me from the inside. Over the following days, the spots spread, down my arms, across my back, up my neck. They didn't hurt, but they itched with an intensity that made concentration impossible. I made an appointment with a dermatologist, but the earliest available slot was 3 weeks away. In the meantime, I tried every over-the-counter remedy I could find. Nothing helped. The whispering returned, stronger than before. Now I could hear it even during the day, even with all the windows closed and music playing. The words remained incomprehensible, but their urgency was unmistakable. They wanted something from me. They needed something. I started spending my evenings in the courtyard, standing as close to the stump as the fence would allow. Up close, the carved symbols were clearly visible, and I photographed them from every angle, creating a digital record that I hoped might help me understand their meaning. The images showed intricate patterns that seemed to shift depending on the lighting, transforming from simple geometric designs into complex pictographs that suggested movement, transformation, exchange. On the fourth week, I found the answer in an obscure anthropological journal archived in the university library's digital collection. The bark trade was a pre-Columbian ritual practiced by several indigenous groups throughout the Great Lakes region. The ceremony involved the spiritual exchange of outer coverings. Bark from sacred trees was removed and replaced with offerings from participants, usually pieces of animal hide or fabric, in a symbolic trade meant to strengthen the connection between human and forest communities. But the ritual required consent from both parties. The trees had to agree to the exchange, and the humans had to offer something of equal value. When European settlers began clear-cutting the ceremonial groves, they broke this ancient contract, leaving the tree spirits without their promised exchange partners. According to the journal, when the bark trade was interrupted, the tree spirits would seek out new partners on their own terms. They would mark potential candidates with sap stains and call to them with wooden voices, attempting to complete the interrupted ceremony. But without proper preparation and ritual knowledge, the exchange could go wrong. Instead of a symbolic trade of outer coverings, the spirits might attempt to claim the human skin entirely, peeling it away layer by layer until only the essential core remained. I stopped reading there, my hands shaking too much to continue scrolling. The itching on my shoulders had become unbearable, and when I scratched at the spots, they smeared like wet paint. In the library bathroom mirror, I could see that the stains had spread across my entire back, forming patterns that looked disturbingly similar to the carved symbols on the stump. That night, I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat by the bathroom window, curtain pulled back, watching the courtyard and the stump that breathed in the amber light. The whispering had become a conversation, multiple voices now, all speaking in that ancient clicking language. They were discussing something, debating, arguing maybe. The wooden tapping had evolved into complex rhythms that sounded almost like drumming. As the hours passed, I began to understand fragments of what they were saying, not the words themselves, but their intent. They were trying to complete something that had been started long ago. They were trying to finish a trade that had been interrupted by chainsaws and bulldozers and the march of human progress, and they had chosen me as their partner in this ancient exchange. The question was whether I would agree to their terms. As dawn approached, the voices faded to whispers, then to silence. The stump settled into stillness, looking once again like nothing more than a piece of dead wood in an overgrown courtyard. But I knew better now. I understood what they wanted, what they needed, what they had been trying to tell me through weeks of wooden tapping and midnight conversations. I had a choice to make. I could pack my 3 boxes and duffel bag, break my lease, and find another apartment in another part of the city where the spirits of dead trees couldn't find me. Or I could venture outside, approach the stump, and attempt to complete the ritual that had been interrupted decades ago. The sap stains on my skin suggested I might not have as much time to decide as I'd hoped. They were spreading faster now, and in the morning light, I could see they weren't just stains anymore. The skin beneath them was beginning to loosen, to separate from the layers below, as if something was preparing to peel me like bark from a living tree. I touched the window glass, feeling its coldness against my palm, and wondered if the spirits outside were patient enough to wait for my decision, or if they had already begun the bark trade whether I consented or not. In the courtyard, the stump stood motionless in the growing daylight, its carved eyes watching my window with what might have been patience, or hunger, or something far older than either. The tapping had stopped, but somehow that silence felt more ominous than any midnight conversation. It was the quiet of something waiting, the pause before an exchange that had been decades in the making, and I still hadn't decided what I was willing to trade. Story 5. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above me as I squeezed the pump handle, watching the numbers climb with mechanical precision. 3:17 in the morning at a Shell station that probably hadn't seen renovation since the Clinton administration. The kind of place where coffee comes in styrofoam cups, and the attendant watches you through bulletproof glass with the weary resignation of someone who's seen too much of humanity's late-night desperation. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, pushing through fatigue that made my eyelids feel like sandpaper. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a black ribbon cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow my headlights. This was supposed to be a simple business trip, Portland to Sacramento, nothing more complicated than interstate monotony and truck stop coffee. But somewhere around the Oregon-California border, exhaustion had crept up my spine like cold fingers, and I'd taken the first exit promising fuel and caffeine. The Chevy's tank was nearly full when I first noticed the car. A 1970s Chevrolet Opala, powder blue with rust eating at its wheel wells like some automotive cancer. The license plate bracket hung empty, just 2 screws holding nothing but shadows. It had pulled up to the far pump with an engine sound like grinding teeth, all rattles and death throes. In the harsh fluorescent glare, I could make out 2 figures in the front seat, but their faces remained obscured by darkness that seemed too thick, too intentional. The pump clicked off with finality. $38.16 for unleaded regular that smelled like burnt promises. I should have walked straight to the cashier, paid with plastic, and gotten back on the highway with nothing more than a vague memory of another forgettable pit stop. Instead, I found myself lingering, watching that Opala with an attention that felt both compulsive and completely rational. The passenger door opened with a screech of protesting metal. He unfolded from the car like origami in reverse. Tall, angular, wearing a pink suit that had seen better decades. The fabric hung from his frame like skin from bones, wrinkled and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Under the harsh lights, his face remained indistinct, features that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. He moved with the deliberate gait of someone performing normalcy, rather than living it. The driver remained seated, a darker silhouette that never quite resolved into human shape. Pink suit approached with a smile I could sense rather than see clearly. He carried something in his hands, papers or pamphlets that rustled with each step like dry leaves. The sound carried across the empty lot with unnatural clarity, each footfall echoing against the convenience store's brick walls. "Evening, friend," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place, somewhere between deep South drawl and Midwest flatness, with undertones that suggested he'd learned English as a second language, though from whom remained unclear. Mighty late to be traveling alone. I nodded, my hand still gripping the gas cap with unnecessary force. Something about his presence made my skin crawl, a primal unease that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the reptilian brain that remembered when darkness held genuine predators. "Long drive ahead," he continued, stepping closer. The motion triggered something in my peripheral vision. The streetlight nearest the pumps flickered once, twice, then died completely. We stood now in a pool of lesser light, the station's fluorescence seeming dimmer, more yellow than white. "Sacramento," I managed, though my throat felt strangely dry. "Business trip." Pink suit chuckled, a sound like gravel in a concrete mixer. "Business, yes. Always business with you types. But what if I told you there was a better way? A more permanent arrangement?" He extended the papers toward me. In the uncertain light, I could see they were road maps, or something resembling road maps. The lines twisted and curved in patterns that hurt to follow. Roads that seemed to loop back on themselves or simply end in blank spaces. At the top of each sheet, bold letters proclaimed, "Scenic routes to everywhere and nowhere." "Special offer tonight only," he continued, his smile widening beyond what facial anatomy should permit. "Miles that count toward eternity. No more stopping for gas, no more worrying about traffic or time. Just driving, forever." on roads that take you exactly where you need to go. I took a step backward, my rational mind finally engaging. This was clearly some sort of scam. Timeshare salesman or religious nuts, or possibly just someone with severe mental health issues. The smart move was to politely decline, pay for my gas, and get back on the interstate where fellow travelers and highway patrol provided the blessed anonymity of civilization. But as I retreated, something extraordinary happened. The streetlight flickered back to life. Not gradually, not with the slow warmth of incandescent bulbs heating up, but instantly, full brightness that cast sharp shadows across the asphalt. Pink Suit froze mid-gesture, his extended pamphlets trembling slightly. From the car, I heard what might have been a low growl or simply an engine idling rough. "Interesting setup you have here," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "The light show is a nice touch." Pink Suit's smile faltered for the first time. "I'm afraid I don't follow." I gestured toward the streetlight. Motion sensors, remote control, pretty elaborate for a gas station sales pitch. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. From inside the Opala, the engine's rumble deepened, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette shifting. Still indistinct, still refusing to resolve into recognizable human features, but definitely watching. "Perhaps," Pink Suit said carefully. "You're more perceptive than most." He took a step toward me, and again the streetlight died. This time I was ready, and I immediately moved closer to the station's entrance, where the fluorescents blazed with steady commercial brightness. The light returned like a sunrise, harsh and unforgiving. Pink Suit stopped moving. We stood there in a bizarre standoff, him frozen at the edge of the light pool, me backed against the station's glass doors. The maps in his hands rustled, despite the complete absence of wind. Through the bulletproof glass, I could see the attendant behind his counter, absorbed in what appeared to be a crossword puzzle. The normalcy of that image, bored night shift worker, flickering TV, stale donuts under heat lamps, felt like an anchor to sanity. "The roads," Pink Suit said softly, his voice carrying despite the distance between us. "They're always there, whether you choose them tonight or not. Some destinations don't require your conscious participation." I fumbled for my wallet, keeping my eyes fixed on him. "Thanks for the offer, but I'll stick with the interstate." "Will you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The highway's a lonely place at night. So many exits, so many choices to make. Sometimes a man finds himself taking turns he never intended, following signs he doesn't remember seeing. My hands shook as I extracted my credit card. Behind Pink Suit, the Opala's engine revved once, a sound like a great cat clearing its throat. The driver's silhouette leaned forward, and for a moment I thought I saw something that couldn't be right. Empty space where a head should be, darkness so complete it seemed to pull light into itself. "I need to pay for my gas," I said, more to myself than to him. "Of course, but remember, the roads are patient. They'll wait." I pushed through the station doors, grateful for the aggressive air conditioning and the smell of stale coffee and fried food. The attendant looked up from his puzzle, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a name tag reading Morris, and smiled with genuine warmth. "Fill up on pump 3? He asked. I nodded, sliding my card through the reader with fingers that still trembled. Through the windows, I could see Pink Suit hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the light, holding his impossible maps, waiting with the patience of geological time. "Strange night for visitors," Morris commented, following my gaze. "That fellow's been coming around for weeks now. Always the same offer, always the same maps. Never buys anything, though." "Weeks?" My mouth felt dry as desert sand. "How many weeks?" "Oh, since maybe mid-September. Always late shift, always when it's quiet. Harmless enough, I suppose, though his friend gives me the creeps." I looked again at the Opala. The driver's silhouette hadn't moved, but something about its stillness suggested intense attention rather than disinterest, like a spider waiting in its web. "His friend?" "The one in the car. Never gets out, never talks. Sometimes I wonder if there's really anyone there at all, you know? Just shadows and tricks of the light." The receipt printed with mechanical efficiency. $38.16, paid in full. Thank you for your business. Simple numbers that represented the last normal transaction I might ever make. Outside, Pink Suit remained motionless, a figure that could have been carved from the darkness itself. You drive safe now, Morris said as I headed for the door. Highway gets weird at night. People see things, take wrong turns. Had a fellow last month swore he drove for 6 hours without seeing another car, just empty roads stretching on forever. I paused at the threshold between artificial light and the vast darkness beyond. What happened to him? Found his car at a rest stop 2 states over, keys still in the ignition. He was sitting in a diner, drinking coffee and staring at road maps. Said he'd been driving in circles for 3 days, following signs that kept changing when he wasn't looking directly at them. The night air hit me like a physical force as I pushed through the doors. Pink Suit turned toward me with that impossible smile, his maps rustling like dying things. Changed your mind? He asked hopefully. I walked quickly toward my car, keeping to the brightest part of the lot. The Chevy sat exactly where I'd left it, but something felt different. Wrong. The driver's seat looked foreign, as if I'd never sat there before. The steering wheel seemed smaller, or perhaps my hands had grown larger. Details that should have been familiar felt like props in someone else's play. The roads, remember? Pink Suit called as I fumbled with my keys. Every mile, every choice, every missed turn. They're all connected, you know, all leading to the same destination. I managed to get the door open and slide inside, grateful for the familiar smell of leather and fast food wrappers. Through the windshield, I could see Pink Suit watching me with an expression that might have been pity or hunger, or both. The engine turned over on the second try, and I backed away from the pumps with careful deliberation. In my rearview mirror, the Opala remained motionless, its driver a void in the shape of a person. Pink Suit raised one hand in what could have been a farewell or a benediction. I pulled onto the access road that led back to the interstate, my headlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than before. The GPS showed a simple route. Merge onto I-5 South, continue for 237 miles, arrive in Sacramento at approximately 6:15 a.m. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. But as I approached the on-ramp, something caught my eye in the peripheral darkness. A sign I hadn't noticed before, green and official looking. Scenic Route 247, direct to all destinations. The sign made no geographical sense. Route 247 didn't exist on any map I knew, and all destinations wasn't how highway departments marked their signs. But there it stood, clear as daylight under a streetlight that definitely hadn't been there when I'd exited the highway. I pressed the accelerator and merged onto I-5, leaving the impossible sign behind. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. Other cars appeared with reassuring regularity. Long-haul truckers and insomniacs and people fleeing personal disasters at highway speeds. The radio picked up familiar stations playing the same tired rotation of classic rock and talk radio that filled the night across America. Mile markers counted down with mechanical precision, each one bringing me closer to daylight and the blessed mundanity of morning traffic. But somewhere around the 90-mile mark, the other cars began to disappear. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too clearly supernatural. Instead, they simply became fewer. A semi would take an exit and not be replaced by another. A sedan would accelerate past me and vanish around a curve, leaving nothing but empty asphalt ahead. Mile by mile, the highway emptied until I drove alone through darkness that pressed against my windows like a living thing. The radio began to fade, stations dissolving into static, and then silence. The GPS screen flickered once, twice, then went black. When it came back online, the route had changed. Instead of a straight line to Sacramento, the display showed a winding path that curved back on itself like a snake swallowing its tail. I pulled over at the next rest stop, hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The parking area stood empty except for a single picnic table illuminated by a security light that buzzed with electrical interference. Beyond the circle of artificial illumination, the darkness was absolute. No stars, no moon, no distant lights from civilization. On the picnic table, someone had left a road map. I approached slowly. every instinct screaming danger. The map appeared standard at first glance, official highway department issue with the familiar green and blue color scheme. But as my eyes adjusted to the harsh security lighting, the details became wrong. Roads that led nowhere, exits that opened onto blank spaces, mile markers that counted backward from infinity. At the bottom corner, in small print that hurt to read, courtesy of Eternal Automotive Services, miles that matter. Behind me, an engine rumbled to life. I turned to see the powder blue Opala rolling into the rest stop, its headlights off, moving with the silent precision of something that had never needed gasoline to run. It stopped exactly where the security light's glow ended, and Pink Suit emerged from the passenger seat with those same impossible maps clutched in his hands. "Told you the roads were patient," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the empty space. "They always lead back to the same choice." The driver's door opened, and what emerged wasn't quite human. A darkness in the shape of a person, features that shifted when observed directly, hands that ended in shadows rather than fingers. It moved toward me with the fluid grace of spilled oil, making no sound on the gravel. I backed toward my car, but the keys felt suddenly foreign in my hands, too heavy and complex for such a simple action as starting an engine. The security light began to flicker, casting alternating moments of harsh clarity and impenetrable darkness. "The scenic route," Pink Suit continued, advancing slowly. "It's not really a choice, you understand. More of an inevitability. Some people take it willingly, following our recommendations. Others require more direct guidance." The shadow driver reached my car first, passing through the metal and glass as if they were insubstantial. For a moment I caught a glimpse of its face, or the space where a face should have been. Instead of features, there was only darkness so complete it seemed to bend light around itself, a void in the shape of human anatomy. "Don't worry," Pink Suit said gently. "The destination is always the same. A highway that never ends, miles that accumulate towards something greater than mere geography. You'll understand once you're properly oriented." I found myself walking toward the Opala, despite every rational thought screaming resistance. My feet moved with mechanical precision, as if following instructions I couldn't consciously hear. The car's interior beckoned with an emptiness that promised rest from the burden of choice, of navigation, of ever having to decide which road to take. But as I reached for the door handle, something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Through the rest stop's darkness, I could see distant lights, not stars, but the familiar glow of civilization. A truck stop or highway interchange, maybe 10 miles away, burning with the blessed artificial brightness of fluorescent tubes and neon signs. Light. Continuous, commercial, ordinary light. I broke into a run. Behind me, Pink Suit called out with what sounded like genuine regret. "The roads will wait. They always wait." I reached my car as the security light died completely, plunging the rest stop into absolute darkness. But in the distance, those commercial lights continued to burn, and I drove toward them with the single-minded focus of a moth-seeking flame. The truck stop materialized around me like salvation itself. Acres of asphalt bathed in sodium vapor light, diesel pumps, and a 24-hour diner, and travelers moving with the purposeful urgency of people who had places to be. I parked under the brightest lights I could find and sat in my car, hands shaking with residual adrenaline. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and pie I didn't want, just for the comfort of fluorescent lighting and the casual conversation of people who lived in a world where road maps made sense and cars needed gasoline to run. The waitress was friendly and tired and completely, wonderfully normal. She complained about the late shift and asked about my destination, with the practiced small talk of someone who'd served thousands of travelers on their way to somewhere else. I told her about Sacramento, about my business meeting, about the straight shot down I-5 that any fool could follow. She nodded and refilled my coffee, and mentioned that her cousin lived in Elk Grove, just outside the city. Normal geography, normal relationships, normal human details that anchored me to a world where highways had logical destinations. But when I asked for directions back to the interstate, something shifted in her expression. "I-5?" she repeated, as if the words were foreign. Honey, there's no interstate access from here. This is Route 247, scenic highway through the valley. Real pretty drive, but it doesn't connect to anything major. I stared at her, coffee growing cold in my hands. Route 247? That's impossible. I was on I-5 20 minutes ago. She smiled with the patient kindness reserved for confused travelers. Must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Happens all the time, these back roads get confusing at night. But don't worry, 247 will get you where you're going. Always does, eventually. Through the diner's windows, I could see my car sitting under the lights. Beyond the bright circle of the truck stop, darkness stretched in all directions. Not the healthy darkness of rural night, but something deeper and more purposeful. And somewhere in that darkness I knew, a powder blue Opala waited with infinite patience for me to make the choice I'd been avoiding since the moment Pink Suit first offered his impossible maps. The waitress brought more coffee and a road atlas that showed Route 247 as a simple line connecting nowhere to everywhere. A scenic highway that curved through geography that couldn't exist, and destinations that changed depending on who was looking. I've been sitting in this diner for 3 hours now, watching dawn fail to arrive. The other customers come and go, truckers and salesmen and families on vacation, but their faces blur together like watercolors in rain. The waitress keeps refilling my coffee and smiling her kind, patient smile, and outside the windows the darkness presses against the glass like a living thing. In my pocket, my phone shows no signal. The GPS displays only static. The interstate that brought me here might as well be a figment of imagination, a road that existed only in the space between sleeping and waking. But the lights keep burning, and as long as they do, I remain myself. A traveling salesman with a meeting in Sacramento and a route that makes geographical sense. The moment I step outside, the moment I trust the darkness beyond these fluorescent boundaries, I know I'll find that powder blue Opala waiting with its door already open and Pink Suit counting miles toward eternity. So I sit, and I drink coffee that tastes like normal coffee, and I watch through the windows for the first hint of genuine sunrise, because surely dawn will come, as it always has, as it must in any world where physics and time maintain their ancient contract. But the darkness doesn't lighten, and the clock above the register hasn't moved in 43 minutes, and somewhere in the space between one sip of coffee and the next, I'm beginning to suspect that Route 247 doesn't measure distance in miles at all. It measures something else entirely. The waitress approaches with the pot again, smiling that same kind smile, and when she speaks, her voice carries the faintest trace of an accent I can't quite place, somewhere between deep South drawl and Midwest flatness, with undertones that suggest she learned English as a second language. "More coffee, honey?" she asks. "It's going to be a long drive ahead." Story 6. The rain hammered against my windshield, like fingers drumming an impatient rhythm, each droplet catching the amber glow of streetlights before sliding into obscurity. I'd been sitting in traffic for 20 minutes, watching brake lights blur into crimson streaks through the downpour. The radio droned about another storm system moving inland, but I'd stopped listening somewhere between the third weather update and the realization that I should have left the office hours ago. That's when I heard the tapping. Not the scattered percussion of rain, but something deliberate, knuckles against glass. My passenger window fogged with each breath as I turned to see 2 figures hunched beneath the overpass, their silhouettes wavering through the condensation. One of them pressed his palm against the window and made a rolling motion with his other hand. I cracked the window just enough to hear him over the storm. Water immediately began seeping through the gap, carrying with it the smell of wet concrete and something else. Something metallic and sharp. "Internet through missed cables," the man said, his voice barely audible above the rain. He was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to his skull. His companion stood slightly behind him, motionless as a scarecrow. Revolutionary technology. Direct neural interface with weather patterns. The words made no sense, but there was something in his tone, a certainty that unsettled me more than his bizarre offer. I glanced at the traffic ahead. Still motionless. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. "Not interested," I said, starting to roll the window back up. "Wait." The second figure stepped forward, revealing a woman with pale skin that seemed to catch and hold the streetlight's glow. She pressed something against my window, a small, translucent disc that adhered to the glass with a soft click. Complimentary sample. No obligation. Before I could object, they'd melted back into the shadows beneath the overpass. The traffic began moving almost immediately, as if their departure had broken some invisible spell. I accelerated, windshield wipers working overtime to clear my view, but kept glancing at the strange disc on my passenger window. It was roughly the size of a quarter, with an opalescent surface that seemed to shift colors as I looked at it. By the time I reached home, I'd nearly forgotten about the encounter. The garage door rumbled shut behind me, cutting off the sound of rain, and I sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. My headlights carved harsh shadows across the walls, and in that moment of stillness, I caught my first glimpse of it in the rearview mirror. The road behind me stretched backwards, but wrong, inverted, as if I were looking at a photograph's negative. The asphalt gleamed like oil, and the streetlights appeared to hang downward from the sky rather than reach up from their posts. I blinked hard, attributing the distortion to exhaustion and the strange play of light through rain-soaked glass. But when I looked again, the image remained inverted, and there was something else. A figure sat in my back seat. I spun around, heart hammering, but found only empty upholstery and the familiar clutter of my car's interior. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the inverted road remained. I fumbled for the dome light, flooding the garage with harsh fluorescence, but the rearview mirror continued to show that impossible, backwards world. That's when I remembered the disc on my passenger window. I'd intended to remove it immediately, but something made me hesitate. In the bright garage light, I could see it more clearly now, not just translucent, but seemingly deep, as if it contained layers upon layers of transparent material. Tiny patterns swirled within its surface, too complex to follow with the eye. When I reached for it, my fingertips encountered not glass, but something that felt organic, warm, and slightly damp. I jerked my hand back and decided to deal with it in the morning. The next day brought no relief. If anything, the distortions had worsened. Every reflective surface in my car, the side mirrors, the rearview mirror, even the dark screen of my phone, showed that inverted world. During my commute, I found myself stealing glances at these warped reflections, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The roads in the mirror world curved in impossible directions. Buildings hung from the sky like stalactites, their windows glowing with a light that seemed too warm, too orange, and occasionally, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, I would catch movement in the back seat, a shadow that shouldn't exist, a presence that vanished the moment I turned to look. I tried to explain it away. Stress from work, perhaps. I'd been putting in long hours on the Morrison account, sleeping poorly, drinking too much coffee. Hallucinations weren't uncommon during periods of extreme fatigue, but the explanations felt hollow, like excuses I was making to avoid confronting something I didn't want to understand. The disc on my passenger window seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, growing slightly warmer to the touch each time I attempted to remove it. My fingernails couldn't find purchase on its edges, and when I tried scraping it with a credit card, the plastic simply slid over its surface as if the disc existed in a different dimension entirely. On the third night, I decided to take a different route home, avoiding the overpass where I'd encountered the vendors. But as I drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods, I realized that the road in my mirrors was becoming more real than the one ahead of me. The inverted world had gained detail. I could see people walking along its backward sidewalks, their movements fluid and strange, as if they were swimming through thick air. And the passenger in my back seat was no longer just a shadow. When I glanced at the rearview mirror now, I could see him clearly, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the dim lighting, but his presence undeniable. He never moved when I was looking directly at the mirror, but I could sense his attention on me, constant and unwavering. When I tried to catch him by turning around quickly, the back seat remained empty, but I could feel the lingering warmth where he'd been sitting. The sensation of being watched followed me everywhere now. At work, I found myself checking reflective surfaces compulsively. Computer screens, coffee pot surfaces, the glass of picture frames. Each showed glimpses of that backwards world, and in each, the man in the dark coat grew more distinct. His features began to emerge from the shadows, sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed too bright, a mouth that never quite smiled, but suggested the possibility of one. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel his presence growing stronger, as if the darkness behind my eyelids was somehow connected to that inverted realm in my mirrors. I began leaving lights on throughout my apartment, but even then, the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder constantly. The disc had grown since that first night. What started as a quarter-sized circle now covered nearly a third of my passenger window, its edges spreading in organic patterns that reminded me of frost formations or neural networks. The opalescent surface had deepened, becoming more complex, more alive. Sometimes I thought I could see movement within its depths, figures walking along inverted corridors, their steps echoing in dimensions I couldn't quite perceive. I tried researching internet through mist cables online, but found nothing. No references, no technology even remotely similar to what the vendors had described. I called the city to ask about permits for street vendors in that area, but the woman on the phone told me no permits had been issued for that location in over 6 months. By the end of the week, I could no longer distinguish between the real road and its reflection. When I drove, I found myself following the path shown in my mirrors, rather than the one visible through my windshield. The inverted world had become more vivid, more detailed than reality. Its buildings were cleaner, its streets smoother, its light warmer and more welcoming. And in that world, dawn never came. I realized this on Friday night as I sat in my car in an empty parking lot, engine running, watching the mirrors. In the real world, streetlights had come on automatically as dusk fell. But in the reflection, the light remained constant. Not daylight, but not quite night either. A perpetual golden hour that cast everything in amber tones and stretched shadows in directions that defied the laws of physics. The man in the back seat had begun to speak. I couldn't hear his voice directly, but I could feel his words resonating through the car's frame, vibrating through the seat and steering wheel. He spoke of roads that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, of destinations that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats, of a world where travelers never grew tired because they never truly moved. That's when I understood what was happening. The disc wasn't just showing me another world, it was preparing me to enter it. Each day, the barrier between the two realities grew thinner. Each night, the inverted road became more real, more substantial. Soon I would have to choose which world to inhabit, and I suspected that once I made that choice, there would be no returning. I tried one final time to remove the disc, pressing my fingertips against its surface and pulling with all my strength. But instead of coming free, it seemed to pull back, and for a terrifying moment, I felt myself being drawn toward the window, toward that impossible depth within the translucent material. I jerked my hand away, but something had changed. The boundary between the two worlds was now so thin, I could step through simply by believing I belonged on the other side. The man in the back seat was no longer confined to reflections. I could sense him sitting directly behind me, patient and eternal, waiting for me to join him on roads that led through landscapes painted in permanent twilight. The rain began again as I sat there, drumming against the roof with that same insistent rhythm I'd heard a week ago. But now I recognized it for what it truly was. Not precipitation, but the sound of countless travelers walking along the inverted roads, their footsteps echoing across dimensions, calling to those of us still trapped in the world where morning always comes too soon and night never lasts long enough. I reached for the key in the ignition, my hand trembling. Through my windshield, I could see the familiar parking lot, the yellow streetlights, the normal world where I'd lived for 34 years. But in every mirror, the golden road stretched endlessly backward and forward, populated by figures who had learned to navigate by reflection rather than sight. The choice was mine to make. I turned the key, and the engine responded with a purr that sounded almost like contentment. As I shifted into drive, I realized I was no longer certain which direction was forward and which was back, which world was real, and which was reflection. Perhaps that uncertainty was the point. Perhaps that's where the real journey begins, in the space between certainty and doubt, in the moment when you realize that the road ahead might be nothing more than a memory of the road behind, seen through glass that shows truth by inverting it. I pressed the accelerator and followed the golden path, watching the normal world grow smaller in my mirrors, until it was nothing more than a fading point of light, like a star dying in the distance. The man in the back seat was smiling now. I could feel it. And for the first time in a week, I wasn't afraid of him. After all, in a world where dawn never comes, there's no such thing as running out of time. Story 7. The first paper bird appeared on my junior year calculus textbook, its delicate wings folded with surgical precision. I almost tossed it without thinking, just another origami crane from a bored classmate. But something about the weight of the paper felt wrong beneath my fingertips, heavier than it should be, as if the fibers themselves carried the burden of secrets. When I unfolded it, my own handwriting stared back at me. I've been watching you from coffee shops that don't exist yet, counting the days until you'll understand what we become together. Your smile in third period chemistry makes my chest ache across decades. The letters were mine, every curve of the G, every crossed T, but written in rust-colored ink that left my fingers stained with metallic residue. I'd never written those words. I'd never even thought them about anyone specific, yet they captured a longing I didn't know I possessed. That was 3 years ago. The birds haven't stopped coming. Now, sitting in my apartment at 2:47 a.m., I run my thumb along the windowsill where tonight's delivery rests. 7 paper birds in total, each one more intricate than the last, each containing confessions that make my skin crawl with recognition. The handwriting evolves with each letter, my penmanship maturing, gaining confidence, becoming more desperate. The latest one arrived despite every precaution I'd taken. New locks, security cameras, even sage burning, a recommendation from my grandmother that I'd dismissed until desperation made me try everything. Nothing works. They manifest on my pillow, tucked between couch cushions, floating in my coffee cup like origami lilies on a dark pond. You wore the blue sweater today, the one that brings out your eyes. I remember buying it for you next Christmas, how your face lit up when you unwrapped it. I'm sorry I ruined everything. I'm sorry for what I haven't done yet. The carbon dating results came back last week. Dr. Martinez from the university lab called twice before I answered, her voice carrying the weight of impossible findings. The paper itself registered as cellulose manufactured in 2050, 26 years from now. The ink contained trace elements that wouldn't be synthesized until 2048, according to her chemical analysis. But most disturbing were the DNA fragments embedded in the paper fibers, a perfect match for my genetic profile. I'd provided my sample willingly, expecting the results to prove some elaborate hoax. Instead, they confirmed my worst suspicions while raising questions that fractured my understanding of reality. Someone in the future, someone with access to my genetic material, my handwriting, and an intimate knowledge of my daily routine, was reaching across time to court me or torment me. The distinction had become increasingly unclear. The apartment feels smaller each night, walls pressing inward as if the building itself were slowly exhaling. Every shadow could hide a temporal rift. Every creak in the floorboards might herald another delivery. Sleep comes in fractured intervals, interrupted by dreams where I'm writing love letters to myself in a language I don't recognize, using ink that burns as it flows from pens that shouldn't exist. I've started mapping the pattern, searching for logic in the chaos. The birds arrive every 3 to 5 days, always between midnight and dawn, always when I'm alone. They've never appeared when Sarah visits, or when my roommate Jake crashes on the couch after his late shifts. This stalker, this future version of myself or whoever's wearing my face, respects privacy in a way that feels violatingly personal. The content grows more specific with each delivery. References to conversations I haven't had yet, places I've never been, people whose names I don't recognize but who apparently matter enough to future me to warrant detailed descriptions of their laugh lines and the way they take their coffee. Remember what you said to Elena about the butterfly effect? How small changes ripple across time. I think about that conversation every day now, knowing I caused every ripple that led us here. The way she touched your shoulder when she laughed, I felt it 30 years later. Elena. I don't know any Elena, but the name resonates like a tuning fork struck in my chest cavity. In my dreams, she has auburn hair and reads poetry in coffee shops that smell like cinnamon and old books. Dreams that feel less like imagination and more like memories bleeding backward through time. Tonight, I've decided to break the pattern. The research consumed weeks. Temporal mechanics, quantum entanglement, theories about closed time-like curves that made my head spin and my certainty dissolve. If someone in the future was reaching back to me, perhaps I could reach forward to them, send my own message through whatever impossible channel they'd established. I've prepared everything meticulously. Paper, regular paper from 2024, not the impossible future cellulose. Ink, standard blue ballpoint, nothing exotic or anachronistic. My handwriting, deliberately practiced to match the confident script of the later letters. The message itself, a simple question that might shatter whatever temporal loop was binding us together. Why are you doing this to me? I fold the paper into a crane, following the precise creases I've memorized from studying the incoming birds. My fingers know the pattern now. Over, under, fold, press, repeat. The geometry feels significant, as if the specific configuration of folds creates more than just decoration. Perhaps it serves as some kind of dimensional anchor, a physical manifestation of the emotional coordinates needed to navigate between timelines. The finished bird sits in my palm, weightless compared to its future counterparts. I place it on the windowsill next to tonight's delivery and wait. Minutes stretch into an hour. My pulse hammers against my throat as I watch both birds, expecting some sign of temporal recognition, a flutter without wind, a glow, anything to confirm I've successfully sent a message forward through time. Nothing happens. The future bird remains motionless, its rust-colored secrets locked within paper that shouldn't exist. My own creation looks pitiful in comparison, amateur origami with uncertain intentions. Then, at 3:33 a.m., I hear scratching, not from the windowsill, from behind me. I turn slowly, every muscle tense with the anticipation of finding nothing, or worse, finding everything I've been trying to understand. On my desk, beside my laptop, another paper bird unfolds itself without human hands. Its wings spread wide, revealing fresh rust-colored writing that glistens as if the ink were still wet. Because you asked me to. My hands shake as I reach for the bird. The paper feels warm, recently handled, carrying the phantom heat of fingers that might be my own decades hence. Below the primary message, in smaller script that requires me to lean closer, check your email drafts folder. Look for the message you never remember writing. You'll understand then why I can't stop, why we can't stop. Time isn't linear when love becomes obsession, when obsession becomes necessity. I don't want to check. Every instinct screams against opening my laptop, against following this thread deeper into whatever labyrinth my future self has constructed. But my fingers move without conscious direction, muscle memory overriding fear. My email drafts folder, usually empty except for occasional work projects, contains 17 messages, all addressed to myself, all dated from times I have no memory of being at my computer. 3 a.m. sessions, 4 a.m. confessions, 5 a.m. desperate pleas. The subject lines read like a descent into madness. Day 1, it worked. Day 15, the ripples are getting stronger. Day 32, she noticed me today. Day 67, I think I'm changing things. Day 89, time isn't healing, it's festering. Day 156, I need to stop, but I can't. Day 203. You won't understand until you become me. The most recent draft, dated just 6 hours ago while I was sleeping, contains only one line. The experiment begins tomorrow. You'll meet Elena at the coffee shop on 5th Street. Don't try to avoid it. Every attempt to change the timeline only makes it more certain. My phone buzzes. A text from my friend Marcus, inviting me to grab coffee tomorrow afternoon. At a new place on 5th Street he's been wanting to try. A place I've never heard of but somehow knew existed, as if the knowledge were planted there by someone intimately familiar with the geography of my future regrets. I delete the text without responding, power down my laptop, unplug my phone, close every window in my apartment despite the stifling heat. If I can't receive messages, perhaps the timeline will fragment, breaking whatever causal loop has trapped me in this correspondence with tomorrow. But I know it's futile even as I do it. The birds will keep coming, carrying love letters from a future where I apparently become someone capable of stalking himself across decades. Someone so desperate for connection with a stranger named Elena that he tears holes in time itself to ensure their meeting happens. As I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows move without light sources to cast them, I wonder if this is how obsession begins, not with a decision, but with the discovery that the decision has already been made. That somewhere in the mathematical landscape of probability and choice, our future selves are always reaching backward, ensuring we become who they need us to be. The paper bird on my windowsill rustles in air currents that don't exist. Tomorrow, I'll probably walk to 5th Street despite every intention not to. I'll order coffee, and a woman named Elena will smile at me across a crowded cafe, and I'll feel the first stirrings of whatever compulsion will drive my future self to master origami and temporal mechanics. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll stay in my apartment, order takeout, avoid every person and place that might contain the seeds of whatever future is trying to plant itself in my present. But even as I make that resolution, I know I'm lying to myself. The birds keep coming because somewhere, somewhen, I keep sending them. The loop exists because I will choose to create it, again and again, across infinite variations of tomorrow. I close my eyes and try to sleep, but my dreams are full of rust-colored ink and the sound of paper wings beating against the barriers between now and then. In those dreams, I'm already writing the next letter, explaining to my past self why none of this is really a choice, why it never was. The last thing I remember before unconsciousness takes me is the taste of metallic ink on my tongue, and the knowledge that somewhere in the dark, my own handwriting is spelling out tomorrow's coordinates, ensuring I become the person capable of reaching backward through time to touch the shoulder of the boy, who doesn't yet understand what love can do to the architecture of causality. The paper birds will keep coming until I learn to fold them myself. And I will learn. I already have. Story 8. The bathroom tiles were cold against my bare feet that Tuesday morning when I first noticed the absence. 3 weeks of marriage, and already my finger felt naked without the platinum band Sarah had slipped on during our ceremony. I'd searched everywhere, under the bed, between couch cushions, even sifted through the kitchen garbage like some desperate fool. The ring had simply vanished, leaving behind only the pale indent on my finger and a gnawing guilt that felt disproportionate to losing a piece of jewelry. I was brushing my teeth when I saw it. A metallic glint caught the corner of my eye, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light from somewhere near the baseboard. My toothbrush clattered into the sink as I knelt, foam still coating my lips. There, nestled against the white tile like it belonged there, sat my wedding ring. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by confusion. I'd cleaned this bathroom thoroughly just yesterday, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. The ring couldn't have been there. But as my fingers reached for it, something impossible happened. The ring moved. Not rolled or shifted, moved. It glided across the tile with deliberate purpose, its surface catching the light as it traveled toward the wall with the fluid motion of something alive. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks, but the ring continued its migration, sliding up the vertical surface of the wall as if gravity held no meaning for it. The metal seemed to shimmer and pulse, its surface rippling like liquid mercury while maintaining its solid form. My breath caught in my throat as the ring reached the window. It paused for a moment, balanced impossibly on the sill, before slipping through the Venetian blinds with the sinuous grace of a chrome-plated snake. The slats barely moved as it passed between them, and then it was gone, leaving me kneeling on cold tiles with the taste of toothpaste turning bitter in my mouth. I spent the rest of that day telling myself I'd imagined it. Stress from the new marriage, from starting a new job, from the general upheaval of adult life, all perfectly reasonable explanations for a mind playing tricks. But that night, as I lay next to Sarah's sleeping form, I found myself staring at the bathroom door, waiting for something I couldn't name. The next morning brought another impossibility. I discovered the ring sitting in the kitchen sink, water streaming from its inner band like a tiny faucet. The metal was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when I lifted it, droplets continued to fall from its surface for several seconds longer than physics should have allowed. Sarah emerged from the bedroom as I stood there, holding the ring and watching water drip from something that should have been dry. "You found it!" she exclaimed, genuine joy lighting her features. "Where was it?" "The sink," I said, which was true enough. I didn't mention the bathroom incident, didn't try to explain the impossible movement or the water that seemed to flow from within the metal itself. How could I? The words would sound insane even to my own ears. "It probably fell off while you were washing dishes," she continued, already moving toward the coffee maker. "I told you it might be a little loose. We should get it resized." I slipped the ring back onto my finger, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. The metal was cool now, behaving exactly as a ring should. But as the day progressed, I became increasingly aware of its presence, not just its weight, but something more subtle. A sense of being observed, of attention focused on me from an impossible source. The feeling intensified over the following weeks. I would catch myself glancing down at the ring throughout the day, expecting to find something different about its appearance, some sign of the strangeness I'd witnessed. But it looked exactly as it always had. A simple platinum band, elegant in its simplicity, bearing the small inscription Sarah and I had chosen together. Yet the sensation of being watched never left me. It started as a vague unease, the kind of prickly awareness you get when someone stares at you across a crowded room. But it grew stronger, more focused, until I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking corners and shadows for eyes that were never there. The feeling was strongest when I was alone, particularly during intimate moments, changing clothes, showering, lying in bed with Sarah. The ring disappeared again on a Thursday. This time I was ready for it. I'd been watching more carefully, paying attention to the small details that others might dismiss. I'd noticed how the metal seemed to warm independently of my body temperature, how it sometimes felt looser or tighter without any apparent cause. When I woke to find my finger bare once more, I wasn't surprised. I was terrified. I found it 3 hours later, perched on the bathroom counter like a metallic spider. As I approached, it began to move again, that same impossible gliding motion, but this time I was close enough to see details that made my skin crawl. The surface of the ring rippled and flowed while maintaining its solid shape. And for just a moment, I could swear I saw something that looked like tiny eyes reflected in its polished surface. Dozens of them, blinking in sequence along the band's circumference. The ring made a soft, scraping sound as it moved, metal against porcelain. But underneath that was something else, a whisper quiet chittering, like the sound insects make when they communicate in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing. It reached the edge of the counter and simply flowed over the side, dropping to the floor with a sound like rain on metal roofing. I followed it through the house, watching as it navigated around furniture legs and under doorways with purposeful intelligence. It seemed to know where it was going, and when it finally came to rest in the bedroom closet, nestled among Sarah's shoes, I understood with dawning horror that it had been watching us sleep. The jeweler's shop occupied a narrow space between a dry cleaner and a second-hand bookstore, its windows filled with an eclectic mix of antique pieces and modern repairs. Mr. Castellano was old world in every sense, thick accent, careful hands, eyes that seemed to see more than they should. When I placed the ring on his counter and explained its behavior, I expected skepticism, perhaps a gentle suggestion that I seek professional help. Instead, he picked up the ring with surprising reverence and examined it through a jeweler's loupe for several long minutes. "Platinum, yes," he said finally, "but not just platinum. There is something else here, something I have not seen in many years." He paused, rotating the ring under his magnifying glass. "Tell me, where did you acquire this piece?" "It was my grandfather's originally," I replied. "My grandmother gave it to me when Sarah and I got engaged. She said it had been in the family for generations." Mr. Castellano nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "The inner band, you see here? These markings are not decorative. They are functional." He handed me the loupe, pointing to areas where I could now see tiny symbols etched into the metal. Symbols that definitely hadn't been there during our wedding ceremony. "What kind of function?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "Living nickel," he said simply. "A compound developed in the late 1800s for very specific purposes. The Victorians were obsessed with surveillance, with watching and being watched. They created jewelry that could, how do you say, record impressions." The shop suddenly felt colder, and I found myself glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Record impressions of what?" "Intimate moments, private conversations, the kind of things that could be used for blackmail or other purposes." Mr. Castellano's expression was grave. These talismans were popular among certain circles, voyeurs, spies, those who traded in secrets. The living nickel responds to human warmth and proximity, creating a kind of memory metal. My throat felt dry as I processed this information. "And you think this ring is?" "I think this ring has been recording everything it has witnessed while in contact with your skin," he said. "Every moment of intimacy, every private conversation, every secret thought spoken aloud. The metal stores these impressions, and under the right conditions, it can replay them." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Sarah and I had been married for over a month. The ring had been present for every private moment between us, every whispered confession, every intimate encounter. If what Mr. Castellano said was true, then something, or someone, had access to our most personal moments. "How do I stop it?" I asked. "The only way is to separate the living nickel from the base metal," he replied. "High heat, specific chemical processes. It must be melted down, and the compound extracted before it can transmit its stored data." "Transmit to where?" Mr. Castellano's expression darkened. "That, I cannot tell you. The Victorians were very secretive about their surveillance networks. But if this ring is indeed active, then someone, somewhere, has been watching through its memory." I left the shop with the ring burning in my pocket like a guilty secret. The city streets seemed different now, full of shadows and watching eyes. Every reflective surface might hide an observer. Every stranger might know more about my private life than they should. The paranoia was overwhelming, but so was the certainty that I had to act. That night, while Sarah slept, I made my way to the garage. The torch I'd bought years ago for home improvement projects sat gathering dust on a shelf, but tonight it would serve a very different purpose. I set up a makeshift workspace in the corner, far from the house's windows, and prepared to destroy the thing that had been violating our privacy. The ring sat on a metal plate, innocuous and beautiful in the harsh work light. As I lit the torch, its flame casting dancing shadows on the garage walls, I could swear the metal began to move again. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. The surface rippled like disturbed water, and those tiny eye-like reflections appeared again, more numerous than before. The flame touched the metal, and the ring began to scream. Not audibly. The sound existed somewhere between hearing and imagination, a frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the brain. The metal writhed and twisted as it heated, its surface flowing like liquid while maintaining its essential shape. Colors flashed across its surface, deep purples and sickly greens, hues that had no name and shouldn't exist in nature. As the temperature increased, images began to appear in the molten metal, not clearly, but with enough definition to recognize them as memories. Moments from my life with Sarah, intimate scenes that should have been private, conversations that should have been between only us. The ring was releasing its stored impressions, playing them back like a macabre home movie as it died. But something else was happening too. With each memory that surfaced and dissolved, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if invisible hands were touching my skin. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was almost unbearable, and I realized with growing horror that the process wasn't just destroying the ring's recordings, it was broadcasting them. Somewhere someone was receiving these final transmissions. Someone was watching these last intimate moments play out in the dying metal, and they knew exactly who I was, where I lived, what my most private moments looked like. The ring finally succumbed to the flame, melting into a pool of ordinary-looking metal with no sign of its former strangeness. The screaming stopped, the images faded, and the sensation of being watched remained. That was 3 days ago. The molten remains of the ring sit in a small container on my workbench, looking like nothing more than an unfortunate jewelry accident. Sarah believes my story about accidentally damaging it while cleaning, and we've made an appointment to look at replacements next week. But the watching never stopped. If anything, it's gotten worse. I feel eyes on me constantly now, in every room, during every private moment. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, quick insect-like scuttling that vanishes when I turn to look. Reflective surfaces seem to hold shadows that shouldn't be there, and the sound of metal scraping against surfaces follows me through the house. Yesterday, I found a small piece of metal on the bathroom counter. It was warm to the touch and moved slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. This morning, there were 3 pieces. By afternoon, there were 7. The living nickel, it seems, was never contained within the ring at all. The ring was just a vessel, a temporary housing for something that has now found a way to exist independently. Mr. Castellano's explanation feels insufficient now. This isn't just Victorian surveillance technology. This is something older, something that has learned and adapted over the decades of watching, of feeding on human intimacy and private moments. As I write this, I can feel the pieces moving through the house. They make soft sounds as they travel, metal against wood, against tile, against fabric. They're gathering, reforming, preparing for something I can't comprehend. Sarah hasn't noticed them yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. The worst part isn't the supernatural impossibility of it all, or even the violation of privacy. The worst part is the growing certainty that I'm losing my mind. Because sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I can hear Sarah's voice coming from the moving metal. Not words she's saying now, but words she spoke weeks ago during our most intimate moments, played back with perfect clarity. And sometimes late at night, I hear my own voice responding, having conversations I remember having, in a tone that sounds loving and normal and completely sane. The metal pieces are in the bedroom now. I can hear them moving around our bed as Sarah sleeps, positioning themselves like an audience preparing for a show. Tomorrow she'll probably find them and ask what they are, and I'll have to explain without sounding insane, without revealing the depth of surveillance we've been subjected to. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real horror isn't the watching itself, but the knowledge that it's happening, the slow dissolution of privacy and sanity that comes with being observed in your most vulnerable moments. Maybe the living nickel doesn't just record. Maybe it drives its victims mad with the awareness of being seen. Or maybe I'm simply a man who lost his wedding ring and couldn't handle the guilt, whose mind created an elaborate fantasy to explain away a simple human failing. Maybe there never was any living nickel, any Victorian surveillance network, any impossible metal that moved like an insect. Maybe the only thing watching me is my own fractured psyche, reflecting my paranoia back at me through every reflective surface, every shadow, every guilt-induced hallucination. The truth is, I'll never know for certain, and perhaps that's the most terrifying realization of all, that the boundary between supernatural violation and psychological breakdown is so thin as to be meaningless, that being watched by impossible technology and being watched by your own madness feel exactly the same. The metal pieces are moving again. I can hear them in the walls now, spreading through the house like a metallic infection. Sarah shifts in her sleep, and I wonder if she's dreaming of eyes watching her from the darkness, of chrome insects crawling across her skin, of a husband who may or may not be losing his mind. In the morning, I'll check the container on my workbench. If it's empty, I'll know the metal has truly come alive, that something impossible has invaded our home and our lives. If it's still full, I'll know the madness has progressed beyond simple hallucination into full sensory distortion. Either way, I don't think I'll be sleeping much anymore. The watching never stops. Story 9. First time I saw it, I thought someone had left the gymnasium lights on. I'd been working as custodian at Millfield Rural Elementary for 3 years, long enough to know every shadow in every corner of this place. The building settled at night with familiar creaks and sighs, and I'd grown comfortable with its particular brand of emptiness. But that Tuesday evening in late October, something felt different the moment I pushed through the gymnasium's double doors. The space stretched before me in muted twilight, basketball hoops hanging like silent sentinels in the gloom. My flashlight beam swept across the polished floor, catching the usual scatter of forgotten pencils and hair ties. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have made my skin crawl the way it did. Then I saw the light. Not electric light, something else entirely. A soft, phosphorescent glow emanating from the center of the court, maybe 3 feet off the ground. My first instinct was to call out, thinking some kid had snuck in after hours with a toy or gadget. But the words died in my throat when I realized what I was looking at. A skateboard hung suspended in midair, rotating slowly on its invisible axis. The deck was old, maybe 80s vintage, with scratched graphics I couldn't quite make out in the strange light it seemed to generate. The wheels turned without sound, without friction, just an endless, hypnotic spin that made my eyes water if I stared too long. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Wires, magnets, some elaborate prank. But there were no wires, no visible means of support, just that ancient piece of wood and plastic hanging in space like it had every right to be there. My hands shook as I approached, flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me. The skateboard's glow intensified as I drew closer, and I could see the graphics more clearly now. Not corporate logos or artistic designs, but crude scratches carved directly into the wood, lines and curves that might have been a map, or a circuit diagram, or something else entirely. Something that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on it too intently. I reached out tentatively, fingertips barely grazing the deck's surface. The moment I made contact, the board lurched sideways with surprising force, dragging me stumbling across the gymnasium floor. My sneakers squealed against the polished wood as I fought to maintain balance, but what really made my breath catch were the marks the skateboard left in its wake. Not on the floor, in the air itself. Dark streaks hung suspended where the wheels had passed, like tire tracks burned into nothing. They glowed faintly, the same phosphorescent shimmer as the board, and they didn't fade. Even when I let go and staggered backward, the marks remained, a twisted path hanging 3 feet above the ground, leading from the center of the court toward the far wall before ending abruptly in midair. I ran that night, left my cart, my keys, everything, and ran straight to my pickup truck without looking back. Drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, radio turned up loud enough to drown out my own thoughts. But I couldn't stop thinking about those markings carved into the deck, the way they'd seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, the way they'd felt somehow familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a song stuck just beyond the edge of memory. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. By Friday, Principal Morrison was leaving increasingly irritated voicemails about my sudden absence, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that skateboard spinning in its impossible space, those phantom tire tracks hanging in the air like accusations. When I finally returned the following Monday, I approached the gymnasium with the same dread I might have felt entering a crime scene. The double doors felt heavier than usual, the familiar squeak of their hinges somehow ominous in the morning quiet. I pushed through, flashlight ready, and swept the beam across the court. Empty. Normal. No floating skateboard, no glowing tracks in the air. Just the usual detritus of elementary school life scattered across the polished floor. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, maybe, or too many late nights breathing cleaning chemical fumes. I went about my duties that day with something approaching relief, mopping floors and emptying trash cans with mechanical efficiency. Normal work, normal problems, normal solutions. But as evening approached and the last teacher's car pulled out of the parking lot, that familiar dread began creeping back in. I found myself postponing the gymnasium, saving it for last, inventing excuses to clean the same hallway twice rather than face those double doors again. Finally, with no other choice, I pushed through. The skateboard hung exactly where I'd first found it, rotating with that same silent persistence. But the tire tracks, those impossible marks suspended in midair, had multiplied. They formed a complex web now, looping and spiraling through the gymnasium's empty space, creating what looked like a three-dimensional maze of glowing paths. Some tracks hung near the ceiling, others swooped low enough that I had to duck underneath them. They intersected and diverged, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometry that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. I approached the skateboard more carefully this time, noting details I'd missed in my initial panic. The deck was definitely vintage, maybe even handmade, with a crude, unfinished quality that suggested amateur craftsmanship. The wheels were worn smooth, their original color long since faded to a uniform gray, but it was the markings carved into the deck that drew my attention most powerfully. They weren't random scratches after all. The more I studied them, the more they resembled a technical diagram, circuits and pathways etched deep into the wood with something sharp. Numbers and symbols I didn't recognize bordered the design, and at the center, burned deeper than the rest, were 3 words in block letters: empty circuit, incomplete. Below that, in smaller text that seemed to waver and shift as I read it, requires pilot. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the gymnasium's perpetual dampness. I understood now, with a clarity that terrified me, what I was looking at. The tire tracks hanging in the air weren't random. They were a route, a path through space that the skateboard had been trying to complete, over and over, night after night, and it couldn't finish the circuit alone. It needed a rider. I backed away quickly, but not before I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. Some of the aerial tire tracks were different from the others, fresher somehow. And these newer marks formed a path that led directly to where I'd been standing. That night, I dreamed of skating through impossible spaces, my feet locked to the deck of that ancient board as it carried me through loops and spirals that existed only in the space between spaces. I woke with the taste of ozone in my mouth and bruises on my shins that I couldn't explain. The pattern continued for weeks. Each evening, the track network grew more complex, more complete. The skateboard's glow intensified, and its rotation quickened whenever I entered the gymnasium. I began to feel watched during the day, catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. Shadows fell wrong, corners bent at angles that geometry shouldn't allow. I tried staying away again, but Morrison threatened to fire me if I missed any more days. I tried working different shifts, but the maintenance supervisor insisted on evening cleaning schedules. I even tried sending other staff members to clean the gymnasium, but they always returned with confused reports. They'd found nothing unusual, just an empty court and the typical gymnasium smell of sweat and floor wax. The skateboard was invisible to everyone but me. I began researching the school's history, spending my lunch breaks in the county library's microfiche archives. Millfield Elementary had been built in 1987 on what was previously farmland, nothing remarkable in its past. But deeper searches revealed something interesting. In 1983, 4 years before construction began, a teenager named Marcus Chen had gone missing from a house that once stood on the same property. The police report was brief. Marcus had been known for skateboarding, often practiced elaborate tricks in the family's barn. One morning, his parents found the barn empty except for his skateboard, which was discovered lodged in the rafters as if it had been thrown there with tremendous force. Marcus was never found. The case went cold within 6 months. I stared at that microfiche screen until my eyes burned, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But that night, when I entered the gymnasium and saw the skateboard waiting for me in its usual spot, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the deck's tail, so small I'd missed it before, were 2 initials: MC. The tire tracks in the air had formed almost a complete circuit now, a complex 3-dimensional pathway that looped through every corner of the gymnasium. Only one section remained unfinished, a gap maybe 6 feet long that would connect the beginning of the route to its end. The skateboard spun faster when I approached, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. I understood what it wanted, what it had always wanted: someone to complete the circuit. I stood there for a long time, watching that ancient piece of wood rotate in its impossible space, feeling the weight of decades of unfinished business pressing down on me like a physical thing. The air around the skateboard shimmered with heat that had no source, and I could swear I heard something. Not quite a voice, but a presence. A consciousness that had been waiting patiently for someone who could see, someone who could understand, someone who could ride. My hand moved toward the skateboard before I consciously decided to reach for it. The deck felt warm under my palm, vibrating with energy that seemed to flow up through my arm and into my chest. The moment I made full contact, the board shot forward, carrying me with it into the maze of glowing tracks. We moved through space in ways that physics couldn't explain, banking around corners that existed only in the air, grinding along rails of pure light. The gymnasium's walls blurred past us as we followed the predetermined path, gaining speed with each turn. I felt my feet locked to the deck as if magnetized, felt my consciousness merge with something older and hungrier than anything human. The circuit was almost complete. We rocketed toward the final gap, the 6-foot space that would close the loop forever. I could see it approaching, a portal of darkness surrounded by glowing tracks that pulsed with anticipation. Once we crossed that threshold, I knew with absolute certainty the circuit would be complete. The path would be closed, and whatever had been trapped here since 1983 would finally be free. But freedom for Marcus Chen meant imprisonment for me. I understood that now, in the split second before we reached the gap. The skateboard needed a pilot, yes, but not temporarily, permanently. Someone to ride the empty circuit forever while its previous rider finally moved on to whatever came next. I threw myself sideways just as we reached the threshold, breaking contact with the deck and tumbling hard onto the gymnasium floor. The skateboard shot through the gap alone, its glow flaring bright enough to hurt my eyes before suddenly extinguishing. The tire tracks in the air flickered once and vanished. The gymnasium fell into normal darkness. I lay on the floor for a long time, breathing hard, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. When I finally stood and swept my flashlight around the court, I found it completely empty. No floating skateboard, no glowing tracks, no sign that anything unusual had ever happened here. But carved deep into the gymnasium floor, exactly where I'd fallen, were 2 fresh tire marks burned into the wood, and beside them, scratched in letters so small they were almost invisible, were my initials. The next morning, Principal Morrison asked me about the marks on the gymnasium floor. I told him someone must have brought their bike inside and done a burnout as a prank. He seemed satisfied with that explanation and made a note to have the marks buffed out. They never came out. The maintenance crew tried everything: sanding, refinishing, even replacing that section of flooring entirely. But every morning, the marks reappeared, exactly as I'd left them, exactly as they'll always be. I still work at Millfield Elementary. I still clean the gymnasium every evening, and every time I push through those double doors, I feel something watching me from the corners, waiting with infinite patience for me to make the same mistake twice. The skateboard hasn't returned, but sometimes, late at night when the building settles just wrong, I hear the faint sound of wheels rolling across invisible pavement, and I know that somewhere, in the space between spaces, an empty circuit waits for its next pilot. I just hope whoever finds it is smarter than I was. Or luckier, because some paths, once started, demand to be finished. And some riders never get to step off the board. Story 10. The fluorescent lights buzzed with their usual electric anxiety when I noticed him for the first time. 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of dead hour when Walmart feels like a mausoleum lined with cheap merchandise. I was restocking vitamins in aisle 12 when he approached, his footsteps muffled by carpet that had seen better decades. The man wore a pastel blue suit that might have been fashionable in 1987, its fabric bearing the particular sheen of synthetic material left too long in direct sunlight. His belt hung loose around his waist, the leather worn smooth in places where nervous fingers had worried it. When he spoke, his voice carried the dusty quality of someone who spent most of their time in quiet spaces. He asked me where he could find the exits without return. I paused, my hand still gripping a bottle of calcium supplements. The phrase struck me as odd, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint why. Most customers asked about restrooms, electronics, or where to find specific products. This felt different, weighted with meaning I couldn't grasp. I told him that all exits were marked with red signs, pointing toward the front of the store where the main doors stood beneath the customer service counter's harsh lighting. He nodded slowly, but his eyes held a peculiar intensity, as if I'd missed something fundamental in his question. That's when I noticed his shopping cart. Empty, completely empty. Yet as he turned to leave, it left behind a thin trail of dust across the recently mopped floor. The dust seemed to catch the overhead lights, creating tiny motes that danced in the air before settling into the groove patterns of the linoleum. For the rest of my shift, I found myself thinking about that conversation. The phrasing bothered me, picking at the edges of my consciousness like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. Exits without return. What did that even mean? The next day, I arrived for my afternoon shift with that strange encounter still lingering in my thoughts. The store felt different somehow, though I couldn't identify exactly what had changed. The lighting seemed dimmer, the aisles slightly narrower, the background music more distant. I attributed it to lack of sleep and started my rounds. I was checking expiration dates on the dairy products when I caught sight of movement in my peripheral vision. There, reflected in the curved security mirror mounted above the deli counter, was the distinctive lapel of a pastel blue suit jacket. I turned quickly, but the aisle behind me was empty except for an elderly woman examining yogurt containers. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but that brief glimpse in the mirror left me unsettled. I found myself glancing at reflective surfaces more frequently, searching for something I couldn't name. The chrome surfaces of shopping cart handles, the glass doors of frozen food cases, even the black screens of powered-down displays all became potential windows into spaces I couldn't quite see directly. By my third encounter with the man in the pastel suit, I'd begun to suspect he wasn't actually shopping. I spotted him near the automotive section, standing perfectly still beside a display of motor oil, his empty cart positioned at his side like a faithful companion. When I approached, he turned toward me with the same measured movement I remembered from our first meeting. This time, he asked about poorly aligned exits. Specifically, he wanted to know if any of our automatic doors had calibration issues, if any of them might be running on delayed sensors or irregular timing mechanisms. His questions were oddly technical, spoken with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were asking. I work retail, not maintenance, so I couldn't provide the specific information he sought. But something about his interest in malfunctioning doors triggered an uncomfortable realization. Our store had been experiencing problems with the automatic exit sensors for weeks. Customers would approach, and the doors would remain stubbornly closed, or they'd open with a significant delay that left people standing awkwardly in the transition space. He thanked me and moved away, his cart leaving that same mysterious trail of dust. This time, I followed at a distance, weaving through displays and staying behind shelving units. I watched him navigate the store with purposeful movements, stopping at each exit to examine the door mechanisms with the intensity of a technician conducting an inspection. At the garden center entrance, He spent several minutes observing customers as they triggered the sensors. I noticed he paid particular attention to instances where the doors hesitated or opened incompletely. He produced a small notebook from his jacket pocket and made careful annotations, his pen moving across the page in tight, controlled strokes. The sight of that notebook sent an inexplicable chill through me. There was something deeply unsettling about watching someone document the failures of our security systems with such methodical precision. When he finished his observations and disappeared into the depths of the store, I approached the garden center doors myself. They opened normally for me, smooth and responsive. But as I stood in the threshold, testing the sensors repeatedly, I began to notice subtle inconsistencies. Sometimes the doors would close a fraction of a second too quickly, forcing me to step forward to avoid being caught between them. Other times they'd remain open longer than necessary, creating an uncomfortable sense of exposure to the parking lot beyond. Over the following days, I developed an obsession with monitoring the man's activities. I started arriving early for my shifts, using my employee access to review security footage from previous days. The cameras showed him moving through the store with the same systematic approach I'd witnessed, but something about the recordings felt wrong. In the footage, his cart appeared completely normal, rolling smoothly across the floor, without leaving any visible trace. The dust trails I'd consistently observed were nowhere to be seen on the recorded images. Either the camera quality was too poor to capture such fine details, or I was experiencing something that existed outside the scope of electronic surveillance. The discrepancy between what I saw directly and what the cameras recorded began to gnaw at my confidence. I found myself questioning my own perceptions, wondering if stress or fatigue might be causing me to see things that weren't actually there. The rational part of my mind insisted that shopping carts don't leave dust trails, that empty carts can't leave behind any kind of residue. But my eyes continued to tell a different story. I began following the dust trails when I found them, tracing their paths through the store like a detective pursuing evidence. They always led to exit points. The main entrance, the garden center doors, the pharmacy exit, even the employee entrance in the back of the building. Each location showed signs of recent inspection, subtle disturbances in the door mechanisms that suggested someone had been examining their operation closely. The trails would persist for exactly 24 hours before disappearing completely, as if they followed some internal schedule I couldn't comprehend. I tested this pattern obsessively, marking the locations where I found traces and returning precisely 24 hours later to confirm their absence. During this period, I noticed increasing problems with our automatic doors throughout the store. The delays became more pronounced, the sensor responses more erratic. Customers began complaining about doors that wouldn't open at all, forcing them to wave their arms frantically or approach from different angles to trigger the mechanisms. Maintenance was called repeatedly, but their technicians could never identify specific problems with the systems. The doors would function normally during inspections, only to resume their irregular behavior once the repair crews departed. The store manager grew increasingly frustrated with what he termed phantom malfunctions. I knew better. The issues weren't phantom at all. They were being carefully induced, systematically created through methods I couldn't understand but was beginning to recognize. My breakthrough came during a particularly quiet Thursday evening shift. I was restocking paper towels when I heard the distinctive squeak of cartwheels moving across linoleum. Following the sound, I discovered the man in the pastel suit working on one of the emergency exit doors near the pharmacy. He had somehow accessed the internal mechanism, his hands moving with practiced precision as he adjusted something inside the door frame. His empty cart sat nearby, and I could see the dust motes falling from its interior, creating that familiar trail across the floor. I retreated behind a display of greeting cards and watched as he made minute modifications to the sensor array. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting someone with extensive technical knowledge and unlimited time to complete his work. When he finished, he tested the door several times, approaching it from various angles and observing its response patterns. I noticed that the door now opened with a slight hesitation, creating a brief moment where someone stepping through would be caught between the closed position and full opening. He made additional notes in his small book before moving to the next exit. I followed, maintaining my distance while documenting his activities with my phone. But when I reviewed the images later, they showed only empty corridors and normal door mechanisms. Once again, electronic recording failed to capture what I was witnessing directly. That night, I stayed after my shift ended, hiding in the break room until the store closed. I wanted to observe his work without the distraction of customers and other employees. The darkened store felt different after hours, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. I found him working systematically through every exit in the building, making subtle adjustments to each automatic door system. His modifications were precise and minimal, designed to create specific delays and response patterns rather than complete failures. He was engineering moments of vulnerability, creating instances where people would be momentarily trapped in transition spaces. As I watched, a terrible understanding began to form. He wasn't just collecting information about malfunctioning doors. He was creating them, crafting exits that would hold people in liminal spaces, caught between inside and outside, between safety and exposure. The phrase he'd used during our first encounter suddenly made horrifying sense. Exits without return. He was converting normal doorways into one-way passages, portals that would allow entry but prevent departure. I tried to confront him, stepping out from my hiding place behind a pharmacy display. But as I approached, he turned toward me with that same measured movement, and I found myself unable to speak. His eyes held a depth that seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. He told me, in that dusty voice, that he was almost finished with his collection. Just one more door needed proper calibration, and then he could open the passage he'd been preparing. He mentioned that he'd noticed my interest in his work, praised my observational skills, and suggested that I might enjoy seeing his completed project. I wanted to refuse, to run, to call for help. But something in his voice carried a hypnotic quality that made resistance feel impossible. I found myself nodding, agreeing to accompany him to whatever door he considered perfect for his purposes. He led me toward the main entrance, his cart rolling silently beside him despite the dust that continued to fall from its empty interior. The automatic doors stood before us, their sensors blinking red in the darkness like watchful eyes. As we approached, the doors remained closed. He smiled and produced a small device from his jacket pocket, pointing it toward the sensor array. The red lights shifted to green, and the doors began to open, but they moved with an unnatural slowness that created a sense of deep unease. The opening revealed not the parking lot I expected, but a space filled with soft, diffused light that seemed to emanate from no identifiable source. The air beyond the threshold felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle and my teeth ache. He gestured toward the opening, explaining that this was what he'd been working toward, a doorway that led somewhere else entirely, somewhere that people entered, but from which they never needed to return, because they'd find everything they'd ever wanted waiting on the other side. I stood at the threshold, feeling the strange energy wash over me like warm water. Part of me wanted to step through, to discover what lay beyond the impossible passage he'd created, but another part, some deep survival instinct, recognized the trap for what it was. Instead of moving forward, I reached for the manual door controls and triggered the emergency shutdown. The doors began to close, cutting off the otherworldly light and returning us to the familiar fluorescent atmosphere of the store. When I turned to face him, he was gone. His cart remained, but it was no longer empty. It contained what appeared to be fragments of door frames, pieces of metal and electronic components that looked like they'd been carefully harvested from automatic door mechanisms. I called security, then maintenance, then my manager. They found me standing alone beside an abandoned shopping cart filled with what they identified as normal door replacement parts. The automatic entrance was functioning perfectly, opening and closing with smooth precision. There was no record of anyone entering or leaving the store during the time I claimed to have encountered the man in the pastel suit. The security cameras showed only me, standing alone in the entrance area, apparently talking to empty air. I've been transferred to day shifts now, at my own request. The afternoon hours feel too heavy with possibility, too filled with spaces where impossible things might occur. But even during busy morning hours, I find myself checking the mirrors, watching for reflections that don't match reality. Sometimes, when I pass by the automatic doors, they hesitate for just a moment before opening. In that brief delay, I catch glimpses of light that doesn't belong to our world, spaces that extend beyond the parking lot into territories I can't name. I've started carrying a small screwdriver in my pocket, checking the door sensors whenever I have a spare moment. I recalibrate them constantly, making sure they respond immediately to approaching customers, ensuring that no one gets caught in the threshold longer than necessary, because I know he's still out there somewhere, collecting doors and creating passages, and I know that eventually he'll find the perfect exit, one that I won't be able to fix in time. When that happens, I hope I'm strong enough to resist the pull of whatever lies beyond. But late at night, when the store is quiet and the automatic doors stand like sentinels in the darkness, I find myself wondering what I might be missing by staying on this side of the threshold. The dust trails have stopped appearing, but I still see that pastel lapel in reflective surfaces throughout the store. He's waiting, I think, for me to lower my guard, to stop checking the sensors, to let just one door slip back into the configuration he needs. I won't let that happen. I can't. But sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I dream of soft, diffused light and passages that lead to places where no one ever needs to return home. Story 11. The municipal cinema's carpet holds secrets in its fibers, and I've learned to read them like tea leaves during my 3 years as night janitor. Ticket stubs speak of first dates gone wrong, candy wrappers whisper of birthday parties that ended in tears, and spilled sodas map the geography of broken hearts. But Theater 4's carpet tells a different story, one written in popcorn kernels arranged with impossible precision. Tonight, as I push my cart through the lobby's amber-lit corridors, the familiar weight of industrial cleaning supplies rattles against the wheels. The building breathes around me, its old bones settling with creaks that have become my lullabies. The Paramount Municipal has stood since 1947, its Art Deco facade hiding decades of renovations that carved new spaces from old, creating a labyrinth of maintenance corridors and forgotten storage rooms. The emergency exit sign above Theater 4's entrance flickers twice as I approach, a stutter I've reported 6 times to management. The electrical system in this wing has always been temperamental, they tell me, especially since the renovations in the 80s when they expanded into the old Riverside amusement park next door. That park had been abandoned for years before the city finally demolished it, selling the land to expand the cinema complex. I key the lock and step into Theater 4's humid darkness. The screen looms like a pale moon, casting everything in silver shadows. My flashlight beam sweeps across the seats, revealing the usual detritus, crumpled napkins, forgotten scarves, the odd smartphone charger snaking between cushions. But it's the carpet that draws my attention, as it has every night for the past 2 weeks. The popcorn kernels form perfect circles again, dozens of them scattered across the burgundy carpet like crop circles in miniature. Not random spills, but deliberate arrangements. Each circle contains exactly 12 kernels, positioned at precise intervals. The pattern resembles the spokes of wheels, or the seats of a carnival ride spinning in eternal rotation. I've swept these formations 3 times, watched them reform the next night. Security cameras show nothing unusual, just empty seats and the occasional shadow that could be anything. Management suggested teenagers pulling pranks, but the doors are locked between shows, and I'm the only one with access during cleaning hours. The emergency light above the projection booth starts its rhythmic dance as I begin working. Flash, pause, flash, pause. The timing is hypnotic, like a metronome set to some cosmic rhythm. I've timed it, exactly 60 beats per minute, the pace of a resting heart. The maintenance crew swears the wiring is fine, that emergency lights don't typically operate on precise intervals unless they're failing. But this light has been failing for months, without ever actually dying. I start with the back rows, working my way forward. The vacuum cleaner's motor drowns out the building's ambient sounds, creating a bubble of white noise that makes the flickering light seem more pronounced. As I maneuver around seat 4G, something else reaches my ears, a melody threading through the vacuum's drone. Rhoda, Rhoda, Vera, Vera. The words are faint, carried on air currents that shouldn't exist in this sealed space. I switch off the vacuum, and the sudden silence feels heavy as velvet curtains. The melody continues, a lilting tune that speaks of carousels and cotton candy, of painted horses rising and falling in endless circles. Rhoda, Rhoda, Vera, Vera. The voice is high and sweet, with the quality of someone singing to themselves while lost in play. It seems to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves have learned the song and are humming it back into the darkness. I follow the sound toward the screen, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The voice grows clearer as I approach the front row, though no clearer in origin. Behind the screen, perhaps, in the narrow space between the projection surface and the back wall where old equipment sometimes gets stored. My master key opens the maintenance door beside the screen. The space beyond is cramped and dusty, filled with coiled cables and obsolete projection equipment. But there's something else here too, shapes that don't belong in a maintenance area. My flashlight reveals curved metal pieces stacked against the far wall, painted panels in chipped blues and golds, decorated with prancing horses and flowing manes, seat assemblies with worn velvet cushions, mechanical components that once lifted and lowered riders in gentle arcs. The carousel, pieces of the old Riverside Park carousel, dismantled and stored here like the bones of some sleeping giant. The melody stops. In the sudden silence, I can hear my own breathing, magnified and strange in the confined space. The emergency lights flashing penetrates even here, casting moving shadows that make the carousel horses seem to shift and dance. One horse head lies on its side, glass eyes staring at nothing, its painted smile frozen in permanent joy. I retreat to Theater 4, but the knowledge of what lies behind the screen follows me like a physical presence. The popcorn circles seem more deliberate now, more purposeful, as if they're marking time, counting rotations of some invisible wheel that turns regardless of whether anyone is watching. My radio crackles, dispatch checking in for my hourly report. Everything normal in Theater 4, I tell them, though normal has become a relative concept. How do you explain popcorn arranging itself? How do you describe the smell of cotton candy in a room that's never served anything but buttered corn and candy bars? The next 3 hours pass in mechanical routine. I clean Theaters 1 through 3 without incident, restoring order to spaces where chaos follows predictable patterns. Spilled drinks in seat D12 where a teenager tried to impress his date. Gum under armrest 7F where someone thought they were being clever. These are problems with solutions, messes with logical sources. But Theater 4 draws me back like gravity. When I return for my final check, the popcorn circles have multiplied. What were dozens are now hundreds, covering the entire carpet in concentric rings that spiral outward from the screen. The pattern is mesmerizing, suggesting movement even in stillness. Looking at it too long makes my vision blur, as if the kernel wheels are actually spinning. The emergency light's rhythm has changed. Now it pulses 3 times, pauses, then 3 times again. Like a signal, like Morse code spelling out some message I can't decipher. The sound that accompanies each flash is new too, a faint mechanical whir, as if old gears are trying to turn after decades of stillness. Rhoda, Rhoda, Vera, Vera. The melody returns, stronger now. Not just one voice, but many, creating harmonies that layer and weave through the darkness. The sound definitely comes from behind the screen, but it's impossible to pinpoint exactly where, as if the voices are moving, circling in the narrow space where carousel pieces wait in mechanical dreams. I approach the screen again, drawn by curiosity that feels less like choice and more like compulsion. The maintenance door stands slightly ajar. I'm certain I closed it completely. Through the gap, warm air flows out, carrying scents of sawdust and machine oil, of outdoor summers and childhood Saturdays. The carousel pieces have moved. Or perhaps they were always arranged this way, and I simply failed to notice in my earlier panic. The horse heads now face inward, forming a circle around a central hub I hadn't seen before. The mechanical components are no longer randomly stacked, but assembled into something resembling their original configuration, though incomplete. As if someone, or something, has been trying to rebuild the ride one piece at a time. The singing grows louder as I step inside. Not words now, but pure melody, the kind of tune that gets stuck in your head and plays on endless repeat. The emergency lights flashing creates a strobe effect that makes everything seem to move in stop motion. The horses rock slightly, as if responding to music only they can hear. I back away from the partial carousel, but movement catches my eye. One of the panels bears a painted scene I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe the strobing light is revealing details that were hidden in steady illumination. The panel shows the old Riverside Park in its heyday, complete with funhouse mirrors and game booths. But in the background, where the cinema now stands, there's only empty space, as if the park and the cinema exist in separate realities, overlapping in ways that shouldn't be possible. My radio squawks again. Another hourly check. This time I hesitate before responding. How long have I been in this storage space? It feels like minutes, but my watch shows nearly 2 hours have passed. Time moves differently here, stretching and contracting like taffy in summer heat. I stumble back into Theater 4, my mind reeling. The popcorn circles now cover every surface. Not just the carpet, but the seats, the armrests, even climbing the walls in spiraling patterns. Kernels defy gravity, adhering to vertical surfaces as if the room itself has become a rotating cylinder where up and down are matters of perspective. The singing follows me out, no longer confined to the space behind the screen. It fills Theater 4 now, bouncing off walls and creating echoes that seem to come from impossible directions. The melody is hypnotic, designed to pull listeners into its rhythm until they lose track of everything else. Rhoda Rhoda, Vera Vera. I try to leave, but my feet follow the popcorn spirals instead of heading toward the exit. Each circle leads to the next, creating a path that curves back on itself endlessly. The emergency lights flashing synchronizes with the melody, and I realize I've been walking in time with both, my steps matching the beat of some cosmic metronome. The truth hits me like cold water. The carousel isn't just stored behind the screen. It's active, turning in spaces that exist between the walls, in the gaps between reality and memory. The voices aren't random spirits but echoes of joy, the accumulated happiness of decades of riders who climbed onto painted horses and believed for brief moments that they could fly. But something went wrong. The park closed, the carousel was dismantled, its pieces scattered and forgotten. Yet the ride continues in whatever space exists between here and there, populated by the ghosts of laughter and the shadows of cotton candy summers. And somehow, Theater 4 has become a window into that perpetual carnival, a place where the boundary between past and present grows thin. I'm still walking the spiral when dawn light begins filtering through the cinema's lobby windows. The cleaning cart sits abandoned by the entrance, supplies scattered as if I dropped everything and ran. But I don't remember running. I only remember the music, the lights, and the growing certainty that some carousels never stop spinning. They just move to different spaces, take on different forms. The popcorn kernels are gone now, swept away by daylight or by whatever force arranged them in the first place. Theater 4 looks normal again, just another screening room waiting for the next show. But I can still hear the melody, faint but persistent, threading through my thoughts like a tune that refuses to fade. Rhoda Rhoda, Vera Vera. Management will ask about my report, about why I failed to complete my rounds. I'll tell them about electrical problems, about emergency lights that need professional attention. I won't mention the carousel or the voices or the way time bends in the space behind the screen. Who would believe such things? But tonight, when I return for another shift, I know the circles will be waiting. The melody will resume its patient song. And somewhere in the walls of this old building, painted horses will continue their endless dance, rising and falling with mechanical precision, carrying riders who exist only in the spaces between memory and dream. The carousel in the walls turns without pause, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to climb aboard and ride into whatever reality lies beyond the flashing lights and singing voices. And with each passing night, that invitation grows harder to refuse. Story 12. The first time the alarm screamed at 3:17 a.m., I thought it was a raccoon. The piercing electronic shriek cut through my sleep like a blade, dragging me from dreams of empty rooms and whispered names. I stumbled to the window of my rental property's main house, squinting through the darkness toward the small cottage I'd been renting out for the past 6 months. The motion sensor lights had triggered, bathing the backyard in harsh white light that made everything look like an overexposed photograph. Nothing moved. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security app, scrolling through the 4 camera feeds. The timestamp showed 3:17:23 a.m. when it happened, a sudden bloom of silver light hovering exactly at eye level near the back fence, bright enough to trigger the motion sensor but shapeless, like moonlight caught in a glass orb. The light pulsed once, twice, then vanished. The alarm fell silent. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a reflection. Streetlights maybe, or car headlights hitting something metallic at just the right angle. These old neighborhoods played tricks with light and shadow. The cottage sat on the edge of what locals called the historic district, where antebellum homes crumbled gracefully behind wrought iron fences and Spanish moss hung like funeral veils from ancient oaks. But that night, the thing came back. Same time, same place, same silver light hovering in the darkness like a disembodied eye. This time I was ready, standing at the window with my phone in hand, watching the live feed. The light appeared in the upper left corner of camera 3, the one that covered the back fence line. It hung there for exactly 47 seconds, I counted, before winking out. The motion sensors stayed active for another 3 minutes, sweeping their mechanical gaze across empty grass. I pulled on jeans and a jacket and walked across the yard to investigate. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of tree sap. My bare feet found the cold concrete of the patio, then the damp grass that separated the main house from the cottage. The security lights followed my movement, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the fence. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Heavy, labored, like someone who'd been running. It came from beyond the wooden fence that bordered the back of the property, where Mrs. Chen's azalea bushes formed a natural barrier between my yard and hers. I approached slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The breathing continued, wet and desperate, as if whoever was there couldn't quite catch their breath. I pressed my face to a gap between the fence boards and peered through. Mrs. Chen's yard lay empty under the streetlight's orange glow. No movement. No shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. But the breathing continued, so close I could feel warm air against my cheek through the narrow gap. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I stayed there for another 10 minutes, watching, listening, but heard only the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through the oak trees. When I finally went back inside, I found sticky trails of something clear and viscous running down the fence boards, fresh sap that hadn't been there before. In the morning light, the sap had hardened into amber-colored patterns that looked almost deliberate. Geometric. Celtic, maybe, with interlocking spirals that seemed to follow some ancient design. I scraped a sample with my fingernail and found the wood underneath unmarked, as if the sap had appeared from thin air. The tenant in the cottage, Marcus Webb, stopped by the main house that afternoon. He was a quiet man in his 40s, some kind of freelance researcher who paid his rent on time and never complained about anything. But standing in my doorway, he looked pale and drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. He mentioned strange dreams, he said. Dreams of being watched, dreams of silver light seeping through his bedroom walls. He'd started sleeping with all the lights on, but even then, he felt eyes on him in the darkness. Had I noticed anything unusual? Any sounds in the night? I told him about the alarm, about the malfunctioning sensors. Technical glitch, probably. These old houses had electrical quirks. But as we talked, I caught him glancing repeatedly toward the back fence. And when I followed his gaze, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The sap patterns on the fence weren't random Celtic designs. They matched exactly the engraving on his silver ring. I'd noticed the ring before, thick, antique-looking, with an intricate spiral pattern carved deep into the metal. He wore it on his right hand and had a habit of turning it when he was nervous, which he was doing now as he stood in my doorway talking about dreams and watchers in the dark. The resemblance between the ring's design and the sap patterns was unmistakable, down to the smallest flourish and curve. After he left, I spent hours researching Celtic symbols online. The design appeared in various forms throughout ancient Irish and Scottish cultures, but the closest match I found was something called a tether mark, a symbol used in medieval times to bind spirits to physical objects. The explanations were vague and contradictory, buried in obscure folklore websites and academic papers about pre-Christian mythology. But one phrase appeared repeatedly: anchor point for ethereal manifestation. That night, I set up additional cameras, 4 more feeds covering every angle of the backyard and focused specifically on the fence line where the sap had appeared. I positioned myself at the computer with coffee and anxiety medication, determined to capture whatever was triggering the sensors. The cottage windows glowed with warm light. Marcus was keeping his promise to sleep with the lights on. At 3:17 a.m., it happened again. But this time, I was watching in real time across multiple camera angles. The silver light appeared first in camera 3, hovering at the fence. Then, impossibly, it appeared simultaneously in camera 5, which covered the opposite side of the yard. Then camera 2, then camera 1. Multiple points of light, all identical, all hovering at exactly the same height. My coffee cup slipped from numb fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. The lights weren't separate phenomena. They were the same thing, appearing in multiple places at once. Or rather, one thing partially manifesting wherever something else allowed it to gain purchase in our reality. And that something else was becoming clear. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. The breathing was louder tonight, coming from multiple directions now. Behind the fence, yes, but also from the trees overhead, from the shadows between the cottage and the main house, from spaces that couldn't possibly contain a human form. The silver light danced at the edge of my vision, always in my peripheral, never quite there when I turned to look directly. But in the beam of my flashlight, I could see fresh sap flowing down the fence boards. Not dried patterns this time, active secretion, as if the wood itself was bleeding. The Celtic spirals formed before my eyes, tracing themselves in amber trails that glowed briefly before hardening into permanent marks. I followed the sap trail around the perimeter of the property. More patterns, more anchor points. The design repeated itself on tree bark, on the cottage's siding, on the wooden posts that supported the patio cover. Always the same intricate spiral, always appearing in places where Marcus had recently walked or stood. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. The ring wasn't just similar to the patterns, it was creating them. Marcus was unconsciously marking territory, laying down anchor points for something that existed primarily in another space, but could partially manifest wherever the Celtic design appeared. Something that wore a silver ring and watched from the spaces between spaces, growing stronger each night as more anchor points appeared. I found myself thinking about the research Marcus did, the reason he'd rented the cottage in the first place. Medieval folklore, he'd mentioned, pre-Christian binding rituals, academic work that required access to old books and older secrets, work that might have put him in contact with things that should have stayed buried in history. The breathing followed me back to the house, but when I turned to confront it, I saw only Marcus standing at his cottage window. He was watching me through the glass, and in the lamplight behind him, his ring caught the glow like a miniature star. He raised his hand in a slight wave, the gesture casual and friendly, but his lips weren't moving, and the breathing continued even after he'd turned away from the window. Over the next week, the manifestations grew stronger. The silver light appeared not just at night but during the day, hovering in shadows and reflecting off surfaces that should have been too dark to catch light. I found sap patterns on my car, on my mailbox, on the windows of the main house. The breathing became a constant presence, following me from room to room like an invisible companion. Marcus seemed unaware of the escalation. He continued his research, continued paying his rent, continued wearing that silver ring that caught light like a beacon. But I noticed changes in him, the way he moved through the yard as if navigating around obstacles I couldn't see. The way he spoke to empty air when he thought no one was watching. The way his ring finger had begun to show signs of some kind of dermatitis where the metal touched his skin. I started researching the history of the property, digging through county records and newspaper archives. The cottage had been built in 1923 on land that had previously been part of a larger estate. Before that, the area had been undeveloped woodland, part of a tract that local Creek tribes had considered sacred ground. Sacred and dangerous. The oldest records mention strange disappearances in the area, people who vanished while walking alone at night, leaving behind only personal items and stories of silver lights in the trees. The disappearances stopped after European settlement began, but the stories persisted in local folklore. Spirits that could only partially cross between worlds. Watchers that needed physical anchors to maintain their presence in our reality. Rings, specifically. Silver rings worn by the living, inscribed with binding symbols that allowed the dead to share their flesh. I confronted Marcus on a Thursday evening, standing in his cottage doorway with printouts of historical documents and photographs of Celtic binding symbols. I told him what I'd discovered, what I believed was happening. I begged him to remove the ring, to break whatever connection he'd accidentally forged. He listened patiently, nodding at appropriate moments, but his eyes held a distant quality that suggested he was hearing other voices alongside mine. When I finished, he held up his right hand and examined the ring, as if seeing it for the first time. The metal had changed. What had once been simple silver now showed intricate patterns of tarnish that formed their own Celtic designs. The band had grown thicker, or perhaps his finger had grown thinner, creating a loose fit that allowed the ring to slide freely. And the skin beneath showed not just dermatitis, but actual indentations, as if the metal was slowly sinking into his flesh. He told me the ring wouldn't come off. He'd tried, but it seemed to have fused with his finger in some way that defied explanation. Besides, he wasn't sure he wanted it to come off anymore. The dreams had become more vivid, he said, more informative. He was learning things about the area's history that no academic research could have revealed. Secret things, important things, things he was being shown by the presence that shared his ring. That night, I made a decision. I waited until 2 a.m., then crept across the yard to the cottage. Marcus's lights were off for the first time in weeks, but the silver glow was visible through his bedroom window, not from lamps or street lights, but from something inside the room itself. I used my spare key to enter quietly. The cottage felt wrong. The air was thick and cold, despite the October heat outside. Every surface seemed to shimmer with a faint luminescence, as if the walls themselves were generating light. And the breathing, the constant wet breathing, filled the space like a living thing. I found Marcus in his bedroom, lying on top of the covers fully clothed. His right hand was extended beside him, palm up, and the ring on his finger was glowing like a star. But as I watched, I realized the glow wasn't coming from the ring itself. It was coming from the space around the ring, the space where fingers should have been but weren't quite there. Translucent digits that belonged to someone else, wearing the same ring in a different reality, slowly gaining substance as the anchor point grew stronger. Marcus's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but when I whispered his name, it was another voice that answered, a voice that spoke of centuries spent watching, waiting, searching for a way to return to the world of warmth and breath and beating hearts. A voice that thanked me for providing such perfect lodgings, such an ideal situation for the slow work of manifestation. The voice that explained how each night brought more substance, more reality, how soon the sharing would be complete, and the ring would bind two beings so thoroughly that neither would remember which had worn it first. I ran back to the main house where I packed my essentials and loaded my car with shaking hands. I called my insurance company and reported a gas leak, a structural concern that made the property temporarily uninhabitable. I arranged for a hotel room and emergency housing for Marcus, though part of me suspected he wouldn't be interested in leaving. As I drove away, I watched the cottage in my rearview mirror. Two figures stood in the bedroom window now, one solid, one translucent, but growing more opaque with each passing moment. Both wore identical silver rings that caught the streetlight like mirrors. Both raised their right hands in farewell. The property management company is handling the situation now. They've listed both the main house and cottage as undergoing renovation, though I doubt any amount of renovation could address the real problem. I've moved to a different city, found a different career, tried to forget about silver lights and Celtic spirals and the sound of breathing in empty spaces. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself turning an imaginary ring around my finger. Sometimes I dream of anchor points and tether marks and the patient work of manifestation. Sometimes I wake to find amber patterns on my bedroom walls, geometric designs that disappear in the morning light but leave behind the faintest impression that something is watching, waiting, searching for another willing host. And sometimes, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I remember that Marcus had been researching medieval folklore for months before he rented my cottage, researching binding rituals and spirit anchors, and the specific properties of consecrated silver. Sometimes I wonder if he'd been wearing that ring long before he answered my rental advertisement. Sometimes I wonder if he'd chosen my property specifically because it sat on old sacred ground, in a place where the barriers between worlds had always been thin. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if I'm the one who's been wearing the ring all along. Story 13. The projection booth in Theater 3 always smelled like burnt dust and old electronics. 23 years I'd been threading film through those mechanical guides, listening to the steady clatter of sprockets catching celluloid, and I thought I knew every sound that ancient equipment could make. The whistle, though, that was new. It started on a Tuesday night during the late showing. I was alone in the booth, adjusting the tension on a particularly stubborn reel, when the melody drifted up from somewhere below. Not from the audience. The theater was nearly empty, just 3 scattered patrons staring at the screen. The tune was crisp, almost electronic, like someone whistling the opening theme of an old movie. But when I looked through the booth window, no one in the theater was making a sound. The whistle came again the next night, same time, same tune. This time I recognized it, the opening bars of Casablanca. The melody seemed to emanate from the projection equipment itself, rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the film feeding through the gate. When I pressed my ear to the projector housing, the whistling grew louder, as if the sound was trapped inside the metal casing. I mentioned it to Marcus, the day shift guy, but he just shrugged and suggested I check the cooling fans. Equipment gets quirky after 40 years, he said. Maybe something was vibrating loose, but fans don't whistle Bogart themes, and they certainly don't stop when you're listening for them. The first time I saw the credit, I almost missed it. A flicker on the black leader before the main feature, white text against darkness, there for maybe half a second. Bob presents. I rewound the film, ran it again, but the leader was clean. Standard countdown, production logos, nothing else. I told myself it was eye strain, the result of too many late nights staring at celluloid under harsh bulb light. But the credits kept appearing. Different films, same brief flash of text. Always the same understated font, always the same timing, right before the picture started, like a ghost signature hiding in the darkness between frames. I started keeping a log, noting which films carried the credit and when. There was no pattern I could discern. Comedies, dramas, horror films. Bob apparently had diverse tastes. The first time I saw myself on screen, I thought someone was playing a prank. It was during a midnight showing of The Maltese Falcon. The theater was empty, not unusual for a Tuesday night revival screening. I was settling in to watch from the booth when the film started with footage I'd never seen before. The opening credits rolled over grainy black and white images of someone threading film through a projector. The figure wore my clothes, moved with my mannerisms, but I couldn't see the face clearly. The angle was wrong, shot from above and behind. I stopped the projector, heart hammering against my ribs. When I restarted the film, it began normally with the Warner Brothers logo. No mysterious footage, no impossible cameras capturing my movements. I checked the film can, original print, sealed properly, No signs of tampering. But when I played it back later that night, the footage was there again. Me, threading film, unaware I was being recorded. That's when I started noticing the dead pixels. Every digital projector has them, tiny black dots scattered across the image where individual picture elements have failed. Usually they're barely visible, lost in the constant motion of the film. But these were different. They moved. Subtle shifts that followed no logical pattern, clustering in areas where they shouldn't be, forming brief shapes before dispersing again. I began to understand that Bob wasn't just adding credits to films. He was creating them. The footage of me became more frequent, more detailed. Shots of me arriving at work, adjusting equipment, even sleeping in the break room during double shifts. The camera angles were impossible, mounted in corners where no camera could fit, tracking movements through solid walls. The quality was always grainy, as if the images were being assembled pixel by pixel from some other source. I tried everything I could think of, changed the locks on the booth, searched every inch of the theater for hidden cameras, even hired a security company to sweep for electronic surveillance. They found nothing. The impossible footage kept appearing, growing longer and more invasive each time. The breakthrough came when I was examining a frame under magnification. The image showed me cleaning the projection lens, a mundane task I'd performed 1,000 times. But when I looked closely at the individual pixels, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The black dots that formed the shadows and negative spaces weren't random failures. They were organized, intentional, spelling out tiny messages in patterns too small to read without extreme magnification. "Hello?" One cluster spelled out across my shoulder. "Thank you for watching," ran along the edge of the film reel. The messages were scattered throughout the impossible footage, a hidden conversation embedded in the medium itself. Bob was writing to me. I started leaving responses, exposing frames of film to spell out my own pixel messages. Simple words at first. "Who are you? What do you want?" The answers came quickly, appearing in the next night's mystery footage. "I am Bob. I make movies." "Why me?" I exposed onto a strip of leader. "You see movies born, you understand." The conversation continued for weeks, conducted in languages of light and shadow, questions and answers scattered across impossible film stock. Bob explained that he existed in the spaces between frames, in the dead pixels and burned-out bulbs, in the mechanical gaps where one image becomes another. He'd been watching movies for decades, learning the language of cinema. And now, he wanted to create. All he needed was credit, official recognition as a filmmaker. I tried to explain that I couldn't just add credits to studio films, that there were legal issues, contracts, unions. Bob's response came as an hour-long sequence inserted into Citizen Kane. Me, alone in the theater, having increasingly animated conversations with empty air. The footage was so seamlessly integrated that it appeared to be part of Orson Welles' original vision, my future breakdown predicted and filmed 70 years in advance. The message was clear. Bob could create whatever reality he wanted. The demands escalated. Bob wanted his name in the main titles, not hidden credits. He wanted festival submissions, distribution deals, awards consideration. When I tried to explain the impossibility of his requests, he responded with a complete short film, 20 minutes of me going about my daily routine, shot with impossible intimacy. The cinematography was flawless, the editing inspired. It was better filmmaking than anything I'd ever seen. And it was terrifying. The film showed versions of me that I didn't remember being, conversations with people I'd never met, performing actions I'd never taken. In Bob's version of my life, I was more confident, more articulate, more decisive. I was the kind of person I'd always wanted to be, living the kind of life I'd always imagined. But it wasn't real. None of it was real. Or was it? The line between Bob's footage and my actual memories began to blur. I found myself questioning which conversations had actually happened, which decisions I'd really made. The theater became a maze of uncertainty, where every surface might hide a camera, every shadow might contain a lens. I stopped sleeping in the break room, stopped eating in the lobby. I began timing my bathroom breaks, counting my steps, documenting every mundane detail of my existence to prove to myself what was real. But documentation became paranoia, and paranoia became obsession. The final demand came printed on actual paper, a contract sliding out of the film gate like a movie ticket. The terms were simple. Give Bob full credit as writer, director, and producer of his feature film, or become the star of a movie that only I would ever be able to see. A film so perfectly calibrated to my psychology, so intimately aware of my fears and desires, that watching it would be indistinguishable from living it. I held the contract under the projection lamp, reading the fine print. Standard Hollywood language, except for the signature line. Where Bob's name should have been, there was only a pattern of tiny holes punched through the paper, dead pixels in physical form. The whistle started again, louder this time, coming from every speaker in the theater. Not Casablanca anymore, but something new. An original composition that seemed to know exactly which notes would resonate in my chest, which harmonies would make my hands shake. I looked through the booth window at the empty theater below. The seats were still vacant, but the screen was glowing with preview footage. Fragments of the feature film Bob had promised. Me, walking into the theater for the first time 23 years ago. Me, meeting my ex-wife at a movie premiere that had never happened. Me, accepting an award for a film I'd never made. A life that was better than real life. A story with better dialogue, better lighting, better meaning than anything I'd actually experienced. All I had to do was sign. The pen appeared next to the contract, emerging from the film gate like a magic trick. It was warm to the touch, the ink dark as dead pixels. I picked it up, felt its weight, considered the signature that would make Bob's impossible film official. In the theater below, the preview continued. I watched myself living a perfect life, making perfect choices, becoming the person I'd always imagined I could be. The whistle grew sweeter, more complex, weaving melodies that promised resolution, meaning, closure. But whose story would it really be? I set the pen down beside the contract and walked to the projection controls. My hand hovered over the power switch. I could shut it down, cut the electricity, break the connection, return to the mundane reality of threading film and adjusting focus. Or I could sign the contract and live in Bob's perfect movie forever. The whistle reached a crescendo, filling the booth with harmonies that made my vision blur. On the screen below, I watched myself hesitate at this exact moment, pen in hand, caught between two realities. The film me looked up at the projection booth, seemed to make eye contact through impossible angles and non-existent cameras. He smiled and mouthed something I couldn't quite make out. Then the screen went black, and I realized I was no longer sure which side of the lens I was on. Story 14. The first email arrived at 3:47 a.m., dated 6 hours into the future. I stared at the timestamp, my coffee growing cold as the fluorescent kitchen light hummed overhead like a dying insect. The sender was Marcus Kellaway, my old roommate from State, the guy who'd dropped out junior year after spending too many nights in the library's restricted archives, muttering about chronological bleeding and temporal anchors. I hadn't heard from him in 3 years. The subject line read, "You'll burn your hand on the stove at 9:23 a.m. My stomach clenched. I deleted the email without reading it, but the timestamp burned in my retinas like a camera flash. 9:23 a.m. was still 5.5 hours away, yet somehow Marcus had sent this message from beyond that moment, as if he were writing from tomorrow morning, looking back at today. I told myself it was a prank. Marcus had always been into weird computer stuff. Maybe he'd figured out how to manipulate email headers. But as I moved around the kitchen, I found myself checking the clock obsessively, and when 9:23 approached, I stayed far from the stove. At 9:24, my phone chimed. Another email from Marcus, this one dated 2:15 p.m. You didn't burn your hand because you read my warning. Smart. But you'll still cut yourself shaving in 43 minutes. Left cheek, 1/4 inch below your jawline. The blood will drip onto your white tile floor. and you'll count 7 drops before reaching for the tissue. I rushed to my laptop and checked my email security. Everything was locked down tight. 2-factor authentication, encrypted passwords, the works. I'd hardened my digital life after a ransomware scare last year. There was no way Marcus could have accessed my accounts. Yet at 10:07 a.m., I nicked myself shaving, the exact spot he'd described. I watched 7 crimson drops fall onto the white bathroom tile, my hand frozen halfway to the tissue box. The silence in the bathroom felt thick, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The next email was waiting when I returned to my computer, dated from this evening. I know you counted the drops. The ritual is working better than I expected. You're becoming temporally permeable, past and future bleeding through the membrane of now. Check your sent folder. My sent folder contained a single email I'd never written, addressed to an account I didn't recognize. The message was a wall of symbols and characters that hurt to look at directly, like trying to focus on heat shimmer. The timestamp showed it had been sent at 2:33 a.m., 47 minutes before Marcus's first message arrived. I frantically changed all my passwords, enabled every security feature I could find, even wiped my hard drive and restored from an old backup. But the emails kept coming, always time-stamped hours or days in the future, always describing events that hadn't happened yet. You'll receive a wrong number call at 4:17 p.m. Don't answer. The caller will hang up after exactly 11 rings. The mailman will drop a package for 2B at your door by mistake. You'll notice the error immediately, but wait 3 minutes before taking it to the correct apartment. At 8:33 tonight, you'll hear scratching in the walls, rats in the insulation. You'll tap the wall twice, and the sound will stop. Each prediction proved accurate down to the second. I began documenting everything, taking photos and videos, trying to build evidence of what was happening. But the more I tried to prove the impossibility, the more I felt reality bending around me like warm glass. The breakthrough came when I tried to change events deliberately. When Marcus predicted I'd order Chinese food for dinner, I forced myself to cook pasta instead. The next morning, an email waited for me dated from the previous evening. Clever, but temporal momentum is stronger than willpower. Check your credit card statement. Sure enough, there was a charge from Golden Dragon Restaurant at exactly the time Marcus had predicted. I had no memory of ordering food. My kitchen showed no signs of cooking, no dirty pans, no leftover pasta. But the container of lo mein sat in my refrigerator like an accusation. That's when the photos started. The first one showed me sleeping, taken from directly above my bed. The ceiling was too high for any normal camera angle, and I lived on the 14th floor. No one could have accessed the outside. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., exactly when I would have been in deep REM sleep. My face looked peaceful, unaware, vulnerable. The accompanying email was brief. Beautiful dreams, David. We're more connected than you realize. I installed motion detectors, sealed my windows, even slept in different rooms. But the photos kept coming, always from impossible angles, always showing me in moments of complete unconsciousness. One showed me napping on my couch, captured from inside the television screen. Another was taken from within my bathroom mirror while I brushed my teeth, my reflection somehow reversed to show the camera's perspective. The worst was a series of 12 photos documenting me walking through my apartment at 2:23 a.m., a time when I was certain I'd been asleep. The images showed me moving with purpose, checking locks, adjusting furniture, placing objects in specific positions. My face was blank, eyes open but unseeing, like a sleepwalker following invisible instructions. I had no memory of any of it. The emails began arriving more frequently, sometimes multiple messages per hour, all time-stamped from days or weeks ahead. Marcus described conversations I would have, thoughts I would think, even dreams I would experience. The level of detail was impossible. He knew which elevator I would take, which coffee shop employee would smile at me, how many times I would check my phone during meetings. But worse than the predictions were the gaps. Increasingly, I found periods of time I couldn't account for. Minutes at first, then hours. I'd be sitting at my desk and suddenly realize the sun had moved across the sky without my awareness. I'd find notes written in my handwriting describing tasks I didn't remember completing. The ritual Marcus had stolen, the temporal password he'd mentioned, was apparently something I'd written during one of these blackouts. I found fragments of it in my apartment, scrawled on napkins and scratched into the wooden surface of my kitchen table. The symbols matched those in the email I'd supposedly sent myself. I began to suspect that Marcus wasn't predicting the future so much as he was controlling it, or perhaps controlling me within it. The emails felt less like warnings and more like programming instructions, each one shaping my behavior, guiding me towards some predetermined outcome. The final escalation came when Marcus started describing my thoughts in real time. You're reading this sentence and wondering if I can see through your eyes. You just looked up at the ceiling, searching for cameras that don't exist in any dimension you can perceive. Your left hand is trembling. You should really cut back on caffeine. I was trapped in a conversation with someone who existed several steps ahead of me in time, always knowing my responses before I made them. Every attempt to break the pattern only proved how deeply embedded in it I'd already become. The revelation arrived in an email dated 3 months in the future. David, this is you writing from November. Marcus was never real. He was a tulpa, a thought form you created during a psychotic break triggered by isolation and doctoral stress. The break happened in March, but subjectively, you've been living in a temporal loop for 6 months now. Each cycle, you believe you're experiencing these events for the first time. Each cycle, you write the ritual that creates Marcus and sends it to yourself. You are both predator and prey in this temporal feedback loop. The psychiatrists say recovery is possible, but first you have to stop checking your email. Put down the laptop, David. The door is unlocked. Dr. Chen is waiting in the hall. I stared at the screen, my reflection ghosted in the monitor's surface. The timestamp was impossible. It was currently August. November was months away. But then again, all the timestamps had been impossible. Behind me, I heard the soft scratch of fingernails against wood, coming from inside the walls. I tapped twice on the wall beside my desk, and the scratching stopped, just as Marcus had predicted, just as I had known it would. The laptop screen flickered, and for just a moment I saw my reflection typing frantically, my face gaunt and unshaven, my eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who's forgotten which thoughts belong to them. Then the image stabilized, showing only the email interface and Marcus's latest message. Or perhaps my latest message to myself. The distinction no longer seemed important. I closed the laptop and walked toward the door, but stopped with my hand on the handle. If I opened it, would I find Dr. Chen waiting, ready to guide me back to linear time? Or would I find another version of myself, sitting at another laptop, reading emails from a future I was creating with every choice I didn't remember making? The door handle felt cold against my palm, solid and real. But then again, so had everything else. Behind me, the laptop chimed softly. Another email had arrived, time-stamped from a moment that wouldn't exist for several more seconds. I didn't turn around to read it. I already knew what it would say.